A forest that kills kings, a crown lost to a stomach ache, skeletons buried beneath staircases and rediscovered in parking lots. For over 1,000 years, the English and British royals have been haunted by eerie echoes, names that repeat, dates that align, patterns too precise to ignore. Coincidences? Maybe. But if they are, they're the kind that whisper across centuries. This isn't just history. It's a kingdom built on riddles. Welcome to 53 Strangest Royal Coincidences That Cannot Be Explained. Keep your eyes open. The past is watching. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a night like this. We've got hours of mystery ahead, and I want you here for all of it. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? Whatever the hour, you're exactly where you're meant to be. 1. The New Forest. Family Curse. The New Forest does not look like a killer. It's a picturesque sprawl of ancient oaks and dappled clearings where wild ponies trot past mossy roots. But if you're a Norman prince, it's a death trap dressed in green. 3 generations of William the Conqueror's male descendants, each of them direct heirs to power, died within the same shadowy woodland, all in eerily similar ways, while hunting in what were officially called accidents. There's no shortage of woods in England, and yet, over a span of roughly 70 years, this one forest swallowed 3 blue-blooded men with impeccable timing. First went Richard of Normandy, William's eldest son, dead in a riding accident that left no detailed witnesses. Then came William Rufus, the king himself, who in 1100 was shot with an arrow while hunting, an arrow allegedly fired by one Walter Tyrrell, who promptly disappeared into the trees. Finally, a third Richard, illegitimate son of Robert Curthose, was also killed in the New Forest during a hunt. Nobody even pretended to know how. Some contemporaries shrugged it off. Accidents happen. Hunting is dangerous. Nobility has a habit of bleeding into the soil. But others whispered that the forest had turned on the Normans, that this was the land's revenge, a delayed uprising by trees, roots, and wind against the conquerors who had razed villages to create this very forest as a private playground. The Anglo-Saxon peasants evicted to make room for royal deer parks might not have survived, but apparently the woods remembered. What made it worse, or more poetic, was the symmetry. A king and 2 potential heirs, all Normans, all riding, all dead. And the forest, a man-made construct of royal privilege turned accidental assassin. Henry Wex, who just happened to be nearby when his brother Rufus took that final arrow, lost no time. He galloped straight to Winchester and claimed the treasury before Rufus's body was even cold. The forest may have whispered, but Henry didn't wait to listen. In that moment, grief was less urgent than logistics. Centuries later, romantic historians tried to read it like a morality tale. You colonize a land, you desecrate its spirit, and then, one by one, it eats your sons. But others see something else. A pattern that doesn't quite rise to conspiracy, but doesn't settle into chance either. An unlucky bloodline meets an unlucky forest, and somehow, history decides to rhyme, which makes the next mystery even more curious. Because it wasn't the forest this time that took a royal heir. It was the sea, and a single ship that shouldn't have sunk. 2. The ship that sank the Angevin dynasty by bad luck. It was supposed to be a routine crossing, a royal convoy leaving Normandy, headed back to England in the winter of 1120. King Henry I had secured his legacy, at least on paper. His only legitimate son, William Etheling, was young, healthy, and very much alive. That evening, the white ship was offered to the prince as a prestigious vessel, captained by Thomas Fitzstephen, whose father had ferried William the Conqueror himself. Legacy, it seemed, was hereditary. The crew was elite. The passengers even more so, around 300 nobles, including some of the most powerful young aristocrats in the realm. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of putting all your top diplomats, royal aides, and the crown prince onto one private jet, and then letting them throw a drunken party mid-flight. Because that's essentially what happened. Wine flowed freely. The sailors joined in. Even the priests, normally brought aboard for blessings, were turned away. Bad vibes, apparently. Then something strange. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, suddenly excused himself before boarding. An upset stomach, he claimed. Whether it was divine intuition or sheer indigestion, that decision may have won him a throne. The ship left port late, drunk, overconfident. The night was dark and the sea unforgiving. Within minutes, the white ship struck a submerged rock and began to sink. William Atheling made it into a lifeboat, but when he turned back to rescue his drowning sister, the boat was swamped by others trying to escape. Everyone aboard drowned, save for one butcher who clung to wreckage and lived to tell the tale. Henry I never got over it. They say he never smiled again. He tried to patch the dynastic rupture by naming his daughter Matilda as heir, but no one really wanted a woman in charge. And so when he died, that same nephew with the upset stomach, Stephen, grabbed the crown. The next 2 decades became a bloody civil war known as the Anarchy. The crown passed through siege, famine, and betrayal like a cursed coin, all because a single ship on a single night hit a single rock. And yet, the odds. What were the chances of the king's entire succession plan drowning in one boat? What were the odds that the man who would later usurp the throne just happened to miss the voyage? What does it mean when the future of a country turns on seasickness? But this wasn't even the only time fate decided to hit copy-paste on a generational error. Because as it turns out, killing your eldest son before he can rule? That's something English kings couldn't seem to stop doing. Strange, isn't it? How one twist of timing can rewrite the crown's entire future. And we're only getting started. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next unraveling. And while we're here, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now? Is it dusk, dawn, or somewhere in between? 3. The Plantagenet. Eldest sons. Curse. The Plantagenets had a talent for inheritance, mainly how not to manage it. 3 generations. 3 golden boys, all groomed from birth to wear the crown. All dead before their fathers. What might look like tragic misfortune starts to feel like a chronic flaw in the royal DNA. Or maybe the monarchy just came with a built-in off switch for firstborn sons. First, there was Henry the young king, son of Henry II, crowned during his father's lifetime in a strange bid to secure loyalty and suppress rebellion. Instead, he rebelled. Died of dysentery at 28, full of regret, half a king with no crown to show for it. Next, Alfonso of Bayonne, the forgotten prince. Eldest surviving son of Edward I, heir to a vast empire. Dead at age 10, in a world where 10 was just old enough to matter politically. His death paved the way for Edward II, a boy more famous for his doomed relationship with Piers Gaveston than any statesmanship. The swap from Alfonso to Edward would come to haunt the throne. Then came the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, the original war hero, son of Edward III, victor at Poitiers, the man everyone expected to rule. But he never did. He died early, riddled with disease. His father outlived him, and the throne passed instead to the Black Prince's son, Richard II, a child monarch with too much power and too few instincts for survival. Each of these deaths sent England lurching sideways, into minority reigns, into weak kingships, into power vacuums where over-mighty subjects ruled in place of boys too young to fight back. It became a rhythm. The promising son dies. The awkward second choice inherits. Civil war looms. You could argue it's just unfortunate genetics or battlefield hazards. But 3 times? In a row? When every one of those alternate kings ends up sparking disaster? Historians later called it mismanagement. Clerics called it punishment. But no one could explain how the pattern repeated with such elegant dysfunction. It was almost as if the crown itself had a preference, not for strength, but for chaos. And when a clear path to peace and continuity appeared, fate shoved it into the nearest grave. And just when you thought the arrows of destiny had finished rearranging royal futures, an actual arrow showed up, in a forest, again. 4. Arrows. Bookending the Norman takeover. History has a taste for symmetry, but it doesn't always tell you when it's about to serve you a perfectly sharpened example. The Norman conquest of England began and ended, symbolically at least, with a pair of arrows. One in an eye, one in a chest. Both fatally inconvenient. Both changing everything. Let's start at Hastings 1066. The famous arrow in the eye story that most schoolchildren grow up absorbing like national folklore. Harold Godwinson, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England, facing off against William the Bastard of Normandy. The battle was long, brutal, and wildly disorganized. But the story that stuck, the story that stitched itself into the Bayeux tapestry and the English imagination, is that Harold died when an arrow struck him in the eye, the exact moment where the old England ended, and William's reality show of feudal hierarchy and French-speaking court life began. Was it true? Maybe. Contemporary sources aren't exactly aligned. Some claim he was hacked down by knights. Others cling to the arrow version like it's holy writ. Regardless, the image of a king brought low by a single arrow became the tidy shorthand for the birth of Norman England. Death by punctuation. And then, 34 years later, another arrow finishes the story. William the Conqueror's son, William II, nicknamed Rufus for his red face and temper, goes hunting in the New Forest. He's struck in the chest by a stray arrow. No one is quite sure who fired it. Officially, it was a hunting accident. Unofficially, let's just say his younger brother Henry was very quick to appear on the scene, and even quicker to ride to Winchester and secure the royal treasury. Historians have always found that speed unnerving. Imagine your brother gets shot in a forest, and your first instinct is to make sure you've got the money before anyone else thinks to ask questions. So we begin with an arrow and end with one. Harold's arrow clears the throne for William. William's son takes one of his own, ending the first phase of Norman rule with an eerie kind of poetic finality. 2 arrows, 2 deaths, 2 seamless transfers of power. If you're willing to ignore the blood, the scandal, and the eerie repetition, it's tempting to see it all as literary, a neat mythic bracket on either end of a dynastic rise. But why arrows? Why this brutal, almost accidental elegance? Because arrows are the least personal form of killing in the medieval world. They fly from nowhere. They make death look like chance. And they're almost impossible to trace back to anyone specific. Which is very useful if you're a younger brother with ambitions. But fate, or something pretending to be fate, wasn't quite finished with its arrow metaphors. Because just a few generations later, another twist of timing created something even stranger than a death on the battlefield. A child inherited not 1 throne, but 2, simultaneously. 5. Infant Double King, by a twist of timing. There's something deeply unsettling about watching a baby inherit a kingdom. It feels like a joke the universe plays on a monarchy. But in 1422 it played that joke twice in the same year, on the same baby. And just like that, little Henry VI, barely old enough to babble, became King of England and King of France. The math is cold and bizarre. Henry V, fresh from his wildly over-celebrated victory at Agincourt, had forced the Treaty of Troyes onto the French crown, disinheriting the Dauphin and securing the throne of France for his own line. It was an audacious move, the kind that only works when you're alive to enforce it. But in August 1422, Henry V died of dysentery at the age of 35. In October, his father-in-law Charles VI of France, mentally unwell, politically sidelined, also died. Their respective deaths left a 9-month-old baby holding 2 crowns his tiny head could never wear at once. This was no golden age. It was a logistics nightmare. The English were thrilled in theory. They had technically conquered France without needing another war. But in practice, neither kingdom was thrilled to be governed in the name of a baby across the channel. And while England was busy fending off domestic squabbles about regency and taxation, France began slowly fermenting into rebellion under the banner of the rightful Dauphin, who, contrary to the Treaty of Troyes, still considered himself king. Meanwhile, Henry VI's early reign was being navigated by committees of powerful men. What could possibly go wrong there? Plenty, it turned out. As Henry grew older, he developed an unshakable talent for passive rule. Not tyrannical, not corrupt, just catastrophically gentle. He read books, avoided conflict, and believed everyone meant well, which, in 15th century court politics, is like walking into a den of wolves and assuming they're just oddly shaped sheep. The result was a collapsing Anglo-French Empire, civil war, and eventually the War of the Roses. Henry's dual inheritance, once seen as divine consolidation, turned out to be a curse. 2 thrones, 0 control, maximum chaos. But the coincidence, the pure statistical unlikelihood, of 2 kings dying in rapid sequence, leaving a baby as ruler of 2 feuding nations, remains a historical anomaly. 1 death? Tragic. 2 deaths, months apart, and politically synergistic? That starts to feel like a cosmic sleight of hand. And as always, when fate opened a royal job posting, someone nearby noticed. Because this baby king may have ruled 2 kingdoms. But he had 2 uncles who saw 1 opportunity. 6. 2 kings, 1 forest, sudden promotions. Forests were the open offices of the medieval elite. They were places to hunt, ride, scheme, and, every so often, inherit a kingdom. When William Rufus died in the New Forest with an arrow in his lung and no one to help, his brother Henry just happened to be nearby. Not in the same hunting party, of course. That would have looked suspicious. He was out there, somewhere else, close enough to smell power bleeding into the soil. When news broke of Rufus's death, Henry didn't stick around to mourn. He didn't even wait to confirm the story with proper witnesses. He sprinted to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, then galloped to London to get crowned before anyone could say succession crisis. Some later chroniclers did the math and found the horse speeds a bit convenient. Others simply admired the hustle. Because even if the arrow was truly an accident, the aftermath was pure tactical genius. But here's where it gets weirder. Because this wasn't the only time the New Forest witnessed the sudden collapse of one royal and the equally sudden rise of another. This forest, already infamous for swallowing princes, seemed to serve as some kind of cosmic transition zone, a place where the crown loosened from one head and reattached to another before the body was cold. It happened again, less dramatically, but just as symbolically, when Rufus's earlier relative, Richard of Normandy, died there decades before. And again with Richard, illegitimate son of Robert Curthose, years later. It's like the forest had a quota to fill, a punch card of royal casualties. To medieval minds, this started to look less like coincidence and more like a moral allegory. The New Forest was created by William the Conqueror through mass evictions and land grabs. He cleared villages to make space for deer. He turned homes into royal playgrounds. Maybe, some whispered, the land never forgot. Maybe the forest took its own kind of tithe. And yet, somehow, those who weren't on the fatal hunt always seemed to benefit. Which raises a question. In a world of bloody succession disputes and mysterious accidents, is it really the forest you should be afraid of? Because next, the universe decides to reach for something grander than trees, something more theatrical. It goes after the crown itself, not by blood, not by arrow, but by drowning it under a freak wave and burying it in the mud. 7. The treasure that sank the king's luck. In October 1216, the English king known as John Lackland found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong temperament, and, crucially, the wrong tide tables. It had been a bad year. Well, actually, a bad reign. And it was about to end in the most humiliatingly theatrical way imaginable, with a royal treasure sinking into a swamp and a dying king left to face the fact that even the land didn't want him anymore. Here's the scene. King John was fleeing rebellion. The barons had turned on him, the French were invading, and England's political structure was about as stable as a sandwich in a trebuchet. In a moment of retreat, he attempted to cross the Wash, an estuarial inlet in eastern England that looks deceptively crossable at low tide. His army had already split into two. John, the cautious soul, went around by safer ground, but his royal baggage train, carrying the crown jewels, personal treasure, state records, and a number of mysterious, precious objects, took the direct route across the tidal flats. It was a logistical shortcut that turned into an historical punchline. The crossing was mistimed, the tide turned, and the entire convoy, carts, horses, guards, loot, was swallowed by the rising sea. Gone. Just like that. No dramatics, no last-minute rescues, just royal wealth quietly sucked into the quicksand. King John wasn't present. But he might as well have been, emotionally speaking. Within days, his health collapsed, and he died at Newark Castle. Some say it was from dysentery, others suggest grief, exposure, or sheer bad luck. Whatever the cause, he exited the stage at precisely the moment his authority did. And what's left is the coincidence. Because let's be clear, monarchs have lost battles, territories, marriages, even their heads. But few have lost the entire concept of kingship in a single watery accident. It wasn't just about gold and trinkets. That baggage train carried symbolic power, the regalia, the records, the evidence of legitimacy. To the medieval imagination, it was more than treasure. It was the physical manifestation of rule. When it disappeared under the mud, something spiritual seemed to vanish with it. The crown didn't just lose its luster, it lost its anchor. And then came the 9-year-old boy. Henry III, John's son, was immediately crowned, using whatever spare relics could be cobbled together. The coronation was rushed, improvised, and materially underwhelming. Yet somehow, this boy king would go on to rule for over 50 years, defying every expectation. The dynasty survived. But something intangible didn't. It's tempting to read the whole Wash disaster as divine commentary. The king who had wrangled with the Pope, taxed his barons into fury, and betrayed his family, dies days after the earth itself consumes his crown. It's the sort of narrative symmetry no propagandist could invent more perfectly. Except history didn't invent it. It just happened. By the sea. In silence. And while it's tempting to blame tides and bad luck, what haunts people isn't how it happened. It's how neatly it fit into the moral narrative. A greedy king loses his treasure. A cruel king loses his authority. A tired king loses his life. But the patterns weren't finished, because the next generation would reveal something even stranger. How royal mistakes could echo down the bloodline, and how kings never seemed to learn from their fathers' fatal friendships. 8. Repeat pattern. Favorites hanged for father and son. Sometimes history doesn't repeat. It replays itself with just enough variation to be insulting. Case in point, the royal habit of surrounding oneself with one beloved favorite, elevating that person far beyond what the political ecosystem can tolerate, and then acting surprised when the whole thing explodes into treason trials, rebellions, and executions. Edward Thirst knew this story. He watched it unfold under his father, Henry III, whose infatuation with the Lusignans, foreign-born half-brothers given lands, titles, and entirely too much power, helped trigger the Barons' War. And yet, despite seeing the risks, Edward's own son, Edward II, decided to rerun the whole drama, but with more flair and even worse judgment. It begins with Piers Gaveston, charismatic, fashionable, and by all accounts, utterly contemptuous of the English nobility. He and Edward II had been close since youth, and when Edward took the throne, he wasted no time showering Gaveston with titles, lands, and the sort of courtly access that made barons see red. What followed was a slow-burn civil unraveling. Gaveston was exiled, recalled, exiled again, and finally captured by rebel lords who, after a show trial that barely pretended to be legal, executed him. The king's grief was real. His political instincts, however, remained in hibernation. Enter Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston was provocative, Despenser was radioactive. Arrogant, power-hungry, and dangerously involved in royal policy, Despenser's influence over Edward II led to a spiral of tyranny accusations, land grabs, and alienated allies. Eventually, the Queen herself, Isabella, turned against Edward and led an invasion that forced his abdication. Despenser was captured and executed. This time, the pageantry of punishment was even more dramatic. What binds these events together is the strange symmetry. Both kings, father and son, fell into the same trap. Each elevated a single man to the role of confidant, counselor, and alter ego. Each alienated the barons. Each watched their favorite die violently. And in Edward II's case, he lost the throne as well. Historians often frame these incidents as moral tales, a warning against letting affection override statecraft. But the deeper unease comes from just how perfectly the pattern repeated. Different names, same script. As if the Plantagenet bloodline had a built-in glitch that made kings see court favorites not as political liabilities but as personal lifelines. And here's the twist. Neither Edward Worse nor Edward II learned the lesson in time. Because personal loyalty, in the medieval context, wasn't a virtue. It was a liability, especially when it involved someone who dressed better, danced better, and insulted people more eloquently than the rest of court combined. But patterns like these don't fade. They mutate. They leave echoes. And soon, a darker pattern would emerge, one tied not to favorites but to a name, a royal name that came with a guarantee. If your son is named Richard, he won't keep the throne. 9. Two Richards, same fate. The name Richard carries a certain regal ring to it, bold, martial, noble. And yet in English royal history that name comes with a particular side effect, throne loss. Fatal, inevitable, and cursed by repetition. First came Richard II, grandson of Edward III, crowned at the tender age of 10 and imbued with that dangerous combination of divine right confidence and adolescent insecurity. He ruled with an artistic temperament, a deep belief in his own majesty, and a gift for alienating every important power base in the realm. Richard II's reign was punctuated by paranoia and poetic justice. He suppressed rivals, exiled nobles, and attempted to concentrate authority into a personalist monarchy well before the kingdom was ready. Eventually, Henry Bolingbroke, his cousin, returned from exile, rallied support, and deposed him with remarkable speed. Richard was imprisoned, quietly removed from the stage, and almost certainly died in custody. His body was displayed with the usual "nothing to see here" formality, but no one really bought it. Then came Richard III, nearly a century later. A very different man, but with a weirdly familiar trajectory. He seized the throne from his nephews, the infamous princes in the Tower, under the guise of protecting the realm from illegitimate succession. He ruled for just over 2 years before being killed at Bosworth Field by the forces of Henry Tudor. His body was buried hastily, forgotten for centuries, and eventually discovered under a Leicester car park, as if history itself couldn't be bothered to remember where it put him. Both Richards were deeply divisive. Both were accused of removing legitimate heirs. Both ruled without an heir of their own. Both were undone by rivals who would go on to reshape the monarchy in their own image. And neither was followed by another Richard. Coincidence? Perhaps. But English monarchs since have avoided the name like it's radioactive. There's never been a King Richard IV, not because the number is unlucky, but because the legacy is. A name that seems to invite instability, rebellion, and a suspicious burial. And what do you do when one cursed name isn't enough? Well, if you're medieval England, you raise the stakes and try putting not one but 3 child kings in a row. Because why not? What could go wrong? 10. 3 boy kings in a row. There are few things more terrifying to a medieval baron than a baby in a crown. Not because infants make particularly ruthless tyrants, but because a child on the throne guarantees chaos in the halls of power. It's not the baby who rules. It's the network of uncles, cousins, courtiers, clerics, and the occasional opportunist who claims they're just keeping the seat warm. And in late medieval England, the throne turned into a high chair 3 times in a row. First came Richard II, crowned at age 10. He inherited the crown after the death of his grandfather Edward III, one of England's most legendary kings, and the premature death of his father, the Black Prince. Richard's reign began with fanfare and poetic promises, but the reality was a king too young to command authority, too reliant on advisors, and eventually too confident in his divine right to listen to anyone at all. He ended up alienating almost everyone, purging his rivals, and getting overthrown by Henry Bolingbroke. Richard II became a textbook case of what happens when you give absolute power to someone raised in a velvet echo chamber. Then came Henry VI, whose royal CV starts with the line, "King since 9 months old." He wasn't just the King of England. He was, by a strange twist of timing, also crowned King of France during the height of the 100 Years' War. 2 thrones, 0 walking ability. That's a tough start for any ruler. Henry grew into a gentle, scholarly man who hated conflict and preferred prayer to politics. Admirable traits in a monk, disastrous in a monarch. His reign saw the collapse of English control in France, the eruption of the Wars of the Roses, and his own repeated mental breakdowns. The realm fractured into competing camps, and Henry became the sad emblem of a monarchy too fragile to stand upright without tripping. And then, Edward V, the lost prince of the Tower. He became king at 12 years old, following the sudden death of his father, Edward IV. But his reign was more technicality than tenure. Before his coronation could even happen, his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared the boy and his brother illegitimate. The princes were taken to the Tower of London, where they vanished from the record. Richard became Richard III. Edward V never officially ruled, but he was a king on paper, briefly and tragically. 3 boy kings, 3 national nightmares, and in each case the real ruling power fell to regents, protectors, and schemers. Minority rule wasn't governance, it was a vacuum, and into that vacuum flowed ambition, manipulation, and very often blood. Why did it keep happening? Some of it was sheer bad luck, heirs dying young, fathers living just long enough to prevent a clean handover, dynasties desperate for continuity, even when the next generation wore swaddling clothes. But part of it was structural. The monarchy had no off switch. A king died and the crown passed immediately to the next legal heir, regardless of their age, experience, or ability to hold their own spoon. And something darker, there was a pattern of older male relatives who didn't seem particularly bothered by the idea of ruling on behalf of a child. These weren't selfless caretakers. They were often the very people who stood to gain if something, hypothetically, were to happen to the rightful heir. That's not paranoia. That's English history. Which brings us to the next mystery. Because while the idea of a boy king in the Tower is already unsettling, what happened when workmen went digging centuries later is the kind of coincidence that haunts even the most skeptical minds. 11. The Princes and the Staircase. There's a reason ghost stories love stairs. They creak, they hide things, they connect the living world with the unseen space beneath. And in the Tower of London, arguably the most haunted fortress in England, one staircase may have offered up the closest thing to an answer that history was never meant to give. The story of the princes in the tower is a tragedy so well rehearsed it has become almost abstract. Two boys, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were lodged in the tower in 1483 by their uncle, the Duke of Gloucester. Soon after, they vanished. No public burial, no official explanation. Just a slow fading from public view and a very convenient coronation. Their uncle became Richard III. Centuries of historians, novelists, and conspiracy theorists have combed through the records, building cases for everyone from Richard III to the Duke of Buckingham to Margaret Beaufort. But none of the theories had a body, or rather, bodies, until 1674. During renovations to the White Tower, workmen dismantling a staircase came across a wooden box buried under a flight of stone steps. Inside were two small skeletons, child-sized, huddled together. No one could prove they were the princes. No one could prove they weren't. But Charles II, who was more interested in symbolism than science, declared they were, and had them reburied in Westminster Abbey under a grand inscription. What makes this discovery so haunting is not that bones were found, it's where they were found. The only contemporary source that described the location of the prince's remains was Thomas More, writing in the early 1500s. He claimed they had been buried at the stairfoot by the men who supposedly murdered them. A small detail, not especially dramatic, not even widely accepted at the time. Yet over 150 years later, under a literal staircase in the exact building they were last seen, two skeletons appeared, exactly where More had said they'd be. Was it coincidence? Confirmation bias? A clever bit of Tudor propaganda maturing into apparent truth? Science hasn't helped much. The bones have never been definitively tested. DNA work has been proposed, blocked, reproposed, and stalled. In the meantime, the narrative has solidified. The stairs were telling the truth all along. But here's the twist. Even if those bones aren't the princes, the story now lives in stone, which is how historical memory works. It's not just about facts, it's about alignments. A whisper from the past lines up with a scrape of a shovel centuries later, and suddenly the line between story and evidence begins to blur. And it wouldn't be the last time history lined itself up too neatly. Because next came a curse. And not just any curse, one that fit the royal family tree a little too well. 12. The curse that matched the family tree. Too well. There are curses that live in books, and then there are curses that seem to crawl out of the margins and start editing the family tree. Sometime in the late 15th or early 16th century, a legend began to circulate. That Elizabeth Woodville, mother of the vanished princes, and her daughter Elizabeth of York, had cursed the person responsible for the boy's disappearance. The curse, according to the whispers, would ensure that the killer's male line would wither and die. Not in flames, not in drama, just slowly, inevitably, like a tree rotting from within. Now, that sounds like folklore, emotional fiction, the kind of poetic justice that helps people live with a historical wound that never really healed. And yet, the family tree seemed to cooperate. Richard III, the man most commonly blamed for the disappearance, died without a surviving legitimate son. His line, through the male Yorkists, unraveled within a generation. The once dominant House of York, champions of hereditary right, winners of multiple battles, vanished as a viable bloodline. The Tudors, who arguably had no true claim, filled the vacuum. To the superstitious, this looked like karmic architecture. A wrong had been committed in the darkness of the tower. The response wasn't divine thunder, it was dynastic collapse. It gets eerier. Elizabeth of York married Henry VII, uniting the warring houses of York and Lancaster. Their son, Henry VIII, would spend his reign obsessed with producing a legitimate male heir, and fail. His only legitimate son, Edward VI, died as a teenager. The Tudor line would sputter, split, and ultimately pass into the hands of the Stuarts. As though whatever was rotten in the House of York had been spliced into the rootstock of the future. Curses aren't real, we tell ourselves. But patterns are. Especially patterns that follow bloodlines like shadows. Especially when every political move, every marriage, every succession seems to happen just a bit too conveniently in the direction the curse predicts. The unsettling part isn't that someone muttered a few vengeful words over a lost child. The unsettling part is that the machinery of English history proceeded as if those words were law, as if some ancient clause had been triggered in the fine print of royal fate. And then, just when the royal tree should have collapsed entirely, a new king emerged, from exile, from nowhere, and the only reason he made it was because the princes had vanished first. 13. The Tudors, saved by a missing king. In the fall of 1483, England lost a king without ever officially burying him. That king was Edward Beau, one half of the infamous princes in the Tower, vanished into shadow before a crown could touch his head. And in that sudden erasure, a new future was born. Not one planned, not one clean, but one the Tudors would later pretend was destiny. Henry Tudor was nobody's obvious first choice. He was born in exile, descended from a disputed line through Margaret Beaufort, a woman who, at the time of his birth, had more reason to fear for her life than dream of a throne. His father was a Welshman who died before Henry was even born. His claim to the throne was paper-thin at best, laughable at worst. And yet, it stuck. Because of a vacuum. When Edward V disappeared, and when his younger brother vanished with him, the Yorkist regime imploded not with revolution, but with silence. Richard III took the crown, but never quite took the people. The mystery of the missing princes loomed behind every royal proclamation like a whisper in the crowd. Where are the boys? It wasn't a question of law. It was a question of trust. The old king's sons were gone, and nobody could say why. But everyone could guess. In that gap, where certainty should have lived, Henry Tudor planted his flag. At Bosworth in 1485, Henry defeated Richard III and became Henry VII. But his victory wasn't just military. It was mythic. He could present himself as the restorer, the unifier, the chosen counterweight to a dynasty that had eaten its own heirs. More importantly, there were no surviving Yorkist princes to contradict him. Because the only boys with a stronger claim were already missing, already presumed dead, already ghosts. Without their disappearance, Henry would have remained a distant claimant. With them gone, he became the only surviving narrative. And here's the part that haunts historians. Had those boys lived, even in captivity, Henry's claim might have been permanently undermined. A living Edward V could have remained a rallying figure for loyalists, a future king in waiting, a political headache. Instead, there was only absence. And the only thing easier to defeat than a rival is a rumor. So the question becomes, was it fate, or was it providence by disappearance? The Tudors certainly didn't ask too many questions. Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, sister of the vanished boys, to seal the dynastic merger. He promoted the idea of reconciliation, even as he quietly purged threats and neutralized potential Yorkist figureheads. But the real victory had come earlier, in the Tower. When someone, whether Richard III or someone acting on their own initiative, had cleared the board, the two missing princes gave Henry something no lineage chart could: an open path, a moral blank check, a kingdom in mourning ready for someone, anyone, to put the crown back on stable ground. And yet that stability would prove slippery, because the Tudors, for all their grandeur, found themselves repeating an old, ugly pattern. Their firstborn sons kept dying, and the crown kept skittering sideways again. 14. The Tudor eldest sons. Pattern repeats, If the Plantagenets were cursed to outlive their sons, the Tudors seemed cursed to never keep theirs alive long enough. They came into power on the bones of vanished heirs, and then spent the next 100 years discovering that royal sons have a bad habit of dying young, inconveniently, or both. Start with Arthur Tudor, firstborn son of Henry VII. Named for the legendary king, groomed from birth to restore a golden age, and married off to Catherine of Aragon as part of a gleaming international alliance. He ticked every dynastic box: strong, educated, charismatic. But in 1502, less than 5 months after his wedding, Arthur was dead at 15. No heir, no second chance. And with him, the Arthurian dream evaporated like steam from the bathwater. That left Henry, Arthur's younger brother, the so-called spare. A second son, less politically prepared, more inclined toward jousts, poetry, and pride. But he took the throne as Henry VIII and immediately began the world's most desperate quest for a male heir. Catherine, now his wife, bore him several children, but only one, Mary, survived infancy. A daughter. Not good enough. The irony, of course, is that Henry spent his reign breaking the English church, decapitating his advisors, and destabilizing half of Europe in order to have a son. When he finally did, Edward VI, it seemed like the pattern might be broken. Edward was healthy, intelligent, pious. He was crowned at age 9 and showed early signs of being a capable, reform-minded ruler. And then, at 15, he died. The cycle repeated. No surviving male heirs. No Arthur 2.0. No Edward the Lasting. Once again the crown skipped sideways, this time into the hands of daughters who had once been declared illegitimate. Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine, took the throne and tried to restore Catholicism. She burned Protestants, married a foreign prince, died childless. Then came Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry had changed the church for. Declared illegitimate by one regime, restored by another, Elizabeth outlasted them all, but never married, never bore a child, and ended the Tudor dynasty with her final breath. It's hard not to see the pattern. The Tudors staked their legitimacy on birthright, and yet every male heir they produced either died young or ruled too briefly to secure the line. The ones meant to rule, Arthur and Edward, were snuffed out. The ones who weren't, Mary and Elizabeth, ended up carrying the dynasty. Just like the Plantagenets before them, the Tudors wrote their legacy not through direct succession, but through a zigzag of accidents, illnesses, and unintended queens. And that irony carried weight. The spares became the rulers, the temporary monarchs became institutions, and the boys, oh the boys, just kept vanishing. Next would come a pair of queens named Mary, both proud, both Catholic, both absolutely certain of their divine mission, and both eventually undone by the very faith they thought would save them. 15. 2 queens, named Mary, both doomed by religion. To be named Mary in royal circles during the 16th century was to inherit something more dangerous than a crown. A theological landmine. 2 queens, 2 distant cousins, 2 Catholic monarchs ruling Protestant kingdoms at 2 different moments in history. Each entered power with purpose, devotion, and a sense of divine destiny. Each exited history with a sentence attached: failure. First came Mary Whites of England, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She was England's first official queen regnant, a woman ruling in her own right, not through marriage. And she came to power with righteous fury. Years of being shunted aside, declared illegitimate, and watching her father dismantle the church she had been raised in, had hardened her into something less forgiving than her early portrait suggested. When her Protestant half-brother Edward VI died, she claimed the throne by right and by faith, overturning Lady Jane Grey's brief, tragic interlude with a burst of popular support. Mary wanted one thing above all: to return England to the Catholic Church. Her devotion was sincere. Her methods, however, were uncompromising. She reversed Protestant reforms, reunited with Rome, and launched a series of persecutions against religious dissidents that would earn her a nickname she never lived to hear: Bloody Mary. It was never just about belief. It was about identity, power, and legacy. She married Philip of Spain to strengthen the Catholic alliance, a move that made her deeply unpopular. She tried desperately to produce an heir. She failed. And when she died in 1558, childless and unloved, she left the throne to her Protestant sister, Elizabeth, the very symbol of everything she'd tried to erase. Then, less than a generation later, another Mary tried again. Mary, Queen of Scots, cousin to Elizabeth I, was also born Catholic, but with a crucial complication. She was Queen of Scotland almost from birth, and Scotland was fast becoming a Protestant nation. Educated in France and widowed young, she returned to her native kingdom with glamour, charm, and a firm belief in divine right. But she walked into a political bonfire. Her reign in Scotland was chaos. She married badly, first a charming drunk, then his probable killer, and alienated almost every powerful faction at court. Protestants distrusted her faith. Catholics doubted her judgment. Her third marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, who was suspected of murdering her second husband, turned her rule from shaky to unsalvageable. She was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son James VI and fled across the border into England, believing her cousin Elizabeth would help. Instead, Elizabeth imprisoned her for 19 years. Mary became a magnet for Catholic plots and international intrigues. Her name, her bloodline, and her claim to the English throne, she was, after all, Elizabeth's heir, made her both a liability and a temptation. Elizabeth, reluctant to execute another monarch, held out for nearly 2 decades, but eventually, under the weight of conspiracies and pressure, she signed the warrant. Mary was beheaded in 1587, dressed in red, the Catholic color of martyrdom, and died with dignity, if not victory. 2 queens, 2 women named Mary, both unflinching in their faith, both ruling lands that no longer wanted their religion, both buried under the weight of religious transformation they couldn't stop. Their stories are often remembered as cautionary tales: queens who couldn't adapt, women who clung too tightly to the past. But maybe the real tragedy wasn't their religion. Maybe it was the timing. They were born too late for Catholic glory, too early for tolerance. They ruled in a world reshaping itself under their feet, and neither realized how fast the floor was moving. Still, fate wasn't finished with the ironies. Because after 2 Marys fell to history, another pair of queens would rise, both named Elizabeth, and both somehow accidental heirs. 16. 2 queens. Named Elizabeth. Both surprises. England has never had a Queen Jane, nor a Queen Anne who ruled without the help of a dying dynasty's tailwinds. But it has had 2 queens named Elizabeth, and both were, in their own ways, royal afterthoughts, unlikely heirs propelled to the throne by the spectacular failures of those meant to rule. Start with Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Born under the shadow of scandal, her mother was executed when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. She spent much of her youth dancing around the edges of legitimacy. First in the line of succession, then out. Declared a bastard. Restored. Sidelined again. Her position depended on the religious and political tides of her father's moods and her siblings' survival rates. No one expected her to rule, but the dominoes fell. Her brother Edward VI died young. Her sister Mary worse died childless. And suddenly Elizabeth, the daughter of the queen who had helped break England from Rome, was the last Tudor standing. She reigned for 45 years, not just a surprise queen, but one of England's most iconic rulers. She turned accident into legacy, her image into myth, her nation into an empire. Now fast forward to the 20th century. Elizabeth II wasn't born to be queen either. She was the daughter of a second son, a girl with a quiet upbringing, expected to live a life of noble obscurity. But then, in 1936, her uncle, Edward VIII, abdicated the throne to marry a twice-divorced American. Her shy, stammering father became George VI, and suddenly little Lilibet was next in line. She wasn't trained for it, at least not at first. But like her namesake, Elizabeth II adapted. When she inherited the throne in 1952, she was 25 years old and utterly untested. Over time, she became the face of a rapidly changing monarchy, a modern queen reigning over a post-imperial Britain trying to remember what it meant to be British. Both Elizabeths began life as political afterthoughts. Both ended up symbolizing stability in eras of disruption, and both owed their thrones not to smooth succession, but to chaos, beheadings, abdications, sibling deaths, broken marriages, the collapse of plans. They were not designed to reign. And perhaps that's why they endured. They weren't born into certainty. They learned to surf the tides. But there's more to the pattern than just poetic symmetry. Because in between these Elizabeths, one king left behind the most baffling legacy of all. 6 wives, an obsession with male heirs, and a string of matrimonial train wrecks that, when laid out, look less like history and more like a dark comedy scripted by fate itself. 17. Henry VIII's wives, names and fates in a pattern. Historians will tell you that Henry VIII's marital history is the stuff of dynastic strategy, religious upheaval, and political intrigue. But if you look at the surface, just the names and fates, something simpler, stranger, and more mechanical seems to appear. It's as if the royal household was being managed by an Elizabethan slot machine, and the machine got stuck on a pattern. 6 wives, 3 names, Catherine, Anne, and Jane, in that order, then again, Catherine, Anne, and Catherine, each marriage ending in a distinct form of failure, divorce, beheading, death, then again, divorce, beheading, survival. It's no wonder schoolchildren still chant the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But the real weirdness isn't the rhyme, it's the grouping, the repetition, the names. 3 Catherines, of Aragon, of Howard, and of Parr. 2 Annes, Boleyn and of Cleves. 1 Jane, Jane Seymour, the sole wife to give him a legitimate male heir and die before things could fall apart. So much repetition for a man supposedly obsessed with moving forward. A king trying to remake England in his own image ended up stuck in a loop of matrimonial déjà vu. And the names weren't the only pattern. The fates, as gruesome, clinical, or natural as they were, played out in eerie symmetry. Both Annes ended in disappointment. One in an annulment so tactful it became an inside joke. The other in an execution that would shake the soul of the realm. The Catherines? 2 were cast aside. One narrowly avoided death by outliving her husband. Jane died young but intact, frozen forever as the perfect wife, partly because she never lived long enough to contradict him. All of this might be explainable by court politics, fertility rates, and the king's boundless capacity for frustration. But over time, the structure hardened into something mythic. The names became ciphers, the rhyme became prophecy, and the man who reshaped the monarchy couldn't seem to reshuffle his personal life beyond a fixed pattern. Even the public memory conspired to lock the whole thing into a grid. 6 portraits, 6 labels, 6 exits. But underneath the labels was a deeper story, not just about Henry's inability to keep a wife, but about the monarchy's bizarre gravitational pull toward familiar shapes. As if the realm itself was less interested in producing heirs than in reenacting fate. And in the middle of this strange carousel of repetition, 2 women stood out even more. 2 cousins, both queens, both teenagers, both condemned by the same man, and both executed in the same place. 18. 2 beheaded cousins on the same patch of grass. It should have been just another grim day in Tudor justice. A scaffold erected, a sentence read, A life ended. But when Catherine Howard stepped onto Tower Green in 1542, what many in the crowd were thinking, but no one dared say, was that they'd seen this show before. Because less than 6 years earlier, another queen had walked that same ground, Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife. She was clever, sharp-tongued, and the mother of Elizabeth I Catherine, Henry's fifth wife, was younger, more naive, and, fatefully, Anne's cousin. 2 queens from the same family, 2 marriages to the same king, 2 executions in the same private courtyard of the Tower of London. It reads like a parody or a bad morality play. But it wasn't fiction. It was a family pattern, one that combined royal paranoia with courtly ambition and a generous dash of bad timing. Both women were accused of betraying the king's trust, though the evidence in both cases remains murky. Anne was accused of adultery and treason, charges bolstered by political enemies and the king's obsessive desire to be rid of her. Catherine was accused of premarital indiscretions and later, worse, an alleged affair while married to the king. Whether any of it would hold up in court today is irrelevant. In Henry's England, accusation was already 9/10 of execution. And there was something else. Something spatial. The tower itself, ancient and symbolic, seemed to collect echoes. Anne's death had been a spectacle. Foreign executioner, elegant words, the quiet horror of a queen made mortal. Catherine's, quieter, less poetic, but the same location, the same cold stones, the same watching walls. It's almost comical how symmetrical it was. 2 Howards, 2 teens, 2 queens, 1 spot. To later generations, the coincidence became a Gothic detail, a reminder that lineage is not armor, that royal favor turns quickly, that marrying a king in Tudor England was as dangerous as leading a rebellion. And what followed both these deaths wasn't closure, but continuity, because from this bloody symmetry would rise a new paradox, that the daughter of one executed queen would be crowned by the daughter of another. 19. The queen, who crowned her own killer's child. If monarchy teaches anything, it's that history has a cruel taste for irony, and few ironies are richer, or more difficult to explain away, than the moment when Elizabeth I took the throne of England. Because to get there, she had to inherit from the very person who had tried to erase her, and in doing so, she effectively inherited her own mother's executioner. Let's break it down. Elizabeth's mother was Anne Boleyn, executed in 1536 after a spectacular fall from grace. Her marriage to Henry VIII had been declared invalid by Mary I, Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon, on the grounds that it was born in adultery and heresy. Mary spent her reign trying to restore the old Catholic order, and in doing so had her half-sister Elizabeth declared illegitimate, unworthy, and deeply suspect. Yet when Mary died in 1558, childless and exhausted by political failures, the only viable heir left was Elizabeth. The daughter of the woman Mary had spent her life trying to erase became queen. It wasn't just poetic, it was operatic. And the kicker? Mary had also, unwittingly, cleared the path. Her brutal persecutions had made the population weary of religious extremism. Her unpopular marriage to Philip of Spain had alienated her subjects. When she died, people didn't revolt. They sighed. And then they looked to Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, for stability. The woman whose mother was condemned by Mary, I ended up succeeding her. No war, no rebellion, just a quiet handoff between half-sisters who had once existed on opposite sides of legitimacy. But this wasn't reconciliation. It was survival. The Tudors, once obsessed with male heirs, were now being preserved by the very daughters their fathers had tried to cast aside. Elizabeth never spoke much about her mother. Publicly, she didn't glorify Anne Boleyn. She didn't build monuments or rewrite official histories. But she didn't need to. Her existence was the monument. Her reign, long, powerful, symbolic, was proof that the crown had passed not through virtue or approval, but through accident, through irony, through a kind of cosmic joke in which the killer's child doesn't just survive, she reigns. And she wouldn't be the last Tudor spare to outshine the heir. Because history was about to repeat itself again, this time with the ultimate royal role reversal, the daughters ruling where the sons could not. 20. The spare, who outlived the heir. Twice over. When people talk about the Tudor dynasty, they talk about Henry VIII's obsession with producing a male heir. The dynastic weight of centuries bore down on his broad shoulders, whispering that only a son could secure the realm. So he built, and destroyed, entire marriages, severed ties with Rome, changed the state religion, and executed anyone who got in the way, all for the promise of one thing, a boy. And he got one. Edward VI, blonde, precocious, Protestant, and for a while, very much alive. Born to Jane Seymour, the only one of Henry's 6 wives to bear him a living son, Edward was immediately lifted like a talisman. At last, England had its next great king. At 9 years old, Edward took the throne with a court of power-hungry protectors around him, steering policy in his name. By 15, he was dead. Enter the spares. Mary White and Elizabeth I, Henry's daughters by Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, respectively, had both at various times been declared illegitimate. Politically inconvenient, set aside, side characters in the tragedy of Tudor succession. And yet, after Edward's brief reign and the even briefer interlude of Lady Jane Grey, it was Mary who took the throne first. The Catholic spare once banished to the margins. Then, after Mary's childless death, Elizabeth, the Protestant spare whose mother had been executed for not giving Henry a son, became queen. The twist? These 2 sideline daughters ended up defining the Tudor legacy more than any of Henry's intended heirs ever could. Mary reigned for 5 years, fought to bring England back to the Catholic fold, and left a country exhausted by religious strife. Elizabeth reigned for 45. Under her, England found a new identity. Part imperial project, part Protestant defiance, part self-styled golden age. She became a legend. The Virgin Queen. Gloriana. The Tudor that stuck. So what happened to the dream of a son who would carry the dynasty forward? It dissolved before it could begin. The very thing Henry built his kingdom around, male succession, crumbled under the weight of his own biology and politics. Meanwhile, the 2 daughters he worked so hard to push aside survived him, outlasted his legacy, and stitched their initials across the nation's future. And perhaps the darkest irony of all, the spares didn't just rule. They became symbols. Where the sons were buried young, the daughters ruled old. Where the heirs fell short, the backups soared. But Henry wasn't the only monarch whose marital miscalculations would echo through history. Because 2 of his wives, both beheaded, may have shared more than just a tyrant. They may have shared a swordsman. 21. 2 queens and a shared executioner. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife and the mother of Elizabeth I, was sentenced to death on charges of adultery, incest, and high treason. The evidence remains dubious, the trial rushed, the verdict inevitable. But one strange detail stuck out. Henry, perhaps out of guilt or image management, imported a skilled swordsman from Calais to perform the execution. It was considered a mercy, faster, cleaner, more dignified, as if dignity could really exist in the act of state-mandated death. The man's name was never officially recorded, but chroniclers referred to him as a French expert, specially requested to ensure Anne's end was precise and less bloody. It was the only recorded time such a method was used for an English queen. Fast forward 6 years, and history begins to echo. In 1542, Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife and Anne Boleyn's cousin, also found herself condemned to die. Young, vivacious, and unprepared for court politics, Catherine was accused of immoral conduct both before and during her marriage. The same machinery that once turned on Anne now turned on Catherine. And here's where the rumors begin. Some accounts, probably apocryphal, certainly suspicious, claim that the same executioner who beheaded Anne Boleyn also dispatched Catherine Howard. Or, if not him, then one trained in the same school, with the same weapon, and the same efficiency. There's no definitive proof. But the idea was sticky. Two cousins, two wives of the same king, executed within the same decade, potentially by the same hand. Whether or not it's true almost doesn't matter. The imagery was irresistible to contemporaries. The quiet repetition of state violence. The way history didn't just rhyme. It seemed to copy and paste. The notion that the king's justice had a favorite blade, a preferred technique, and maybe even a preferred executioner. And of course, both executions took place at Tower Green, the same private space reserved for nobles and royals, the same ghost-laden corner of the fortress where whispers hang in the mist. Anne faced her death with wit and dignity. Catherine was barely more than a girl, terrified and tragic. Two women, same bloodline, same king, same end. Possibly the same man with the sword. The symmetry was unnerving. But symmetry in royal death wasn't rare. In fact, sometimes it reached absurd levels of irony, like when a king who believed himself chosen by God died under a ceiling that literally painted him that way. 22. Execution under Dad's ceiling. Charles I was not the first English monarch to believe in the divine right of kings, but he might have been the most stubborn about it. To him, kingship wasn't just power, it was theology, sacred, preordained, immutable. Parliament, popular sentiment, and financial reality were, at best, distractions, at worst, heresies. That attitude, as you might guess, did not age well. By the 1640s, England was spiraling into civil war. Charles clashed with Parliament over everything: taxes, religion, authority, until the country split between royalists and parliamentarians. The war ended badly for Charles. Captured, tried, and sentenced, he was led to execution not in some back alley or battlefield tent, but in the heart of his own capital. The scaffold was built outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, the very building Charles's father, James I, had commissioned and decorated with a ceiling painting by Peter Paul Rubens, an elaborate work glorifying the divine authority of monarchs. Angels, crowns, celestial light. The triumph of order through royal will. So when Charles I stepped onto the scaffold on January 30th, 1649, he was quite literally standing beneath the image of his father being welcomed into heaven as a God-chosen ruler. It wasn't just symbolism, it was absurdist theater. The king who insisted he ruled by divine right was executed under a ceiling that claimed it was so. To some, it was blasphemy. To others, poetic justice. The celestial above, the executioner below, and in between, a monarch who couldn't quite understand why the world refused to see him the way he saw himself. Rubens' ceiling remains intact to this day. You can visit it. You can stare up at the grandeur, the swirling divine affirmations of kingship, and remember that just beneath it, the divine right of kings died in one clean cut. But the name Charles wasn't quite done haunting the monarchy, because less than 50 years later, another Charles, his grandson, would watch the same kingdom rebel again. This time there'd be no execution, just exile. Different ending, same name, same crisis. 23. Two civil wars, two executed or expelled kings named Charles. The name Charles carries weight in English history. Not the romantic kind, not the noble variety either, but a kind of bruised, storm-shadowed weight, where the crown rests uneasily and the ground beneath the throne never quite dries. Both Charles I and Charles II, father and son, found themselves at the center of civil crises that tested, stretched, and eventually broke the royal illusion of divine permanence. And both would see that name, Charles, become a red flag for instability. Charles I, as we've seen, pushed his belief in divine right too far. He found himself on the wrong side of Parliament, the army, and public patience. He was executed in 1649, his monarchy abolished. His son, Charles II, went into exile, living a lavishly underfunded life in foreign courts, watching his father become a martyr, and a cautionary tale. For over a decade, England flirted with republicanism until the Restoration in 1660 brought Charles II back to the throne with the nation exhaling relief. But peace is rarely inherited. Charles II learned from his father's fall, but the political ground remained shaky. He avoided confrontation when he could, played Parliament against itself, and maintained a public image that masked private cynicism. He died without legitimate issue in 1685, passing the crown to his brother James II, whose reign unraveled even faster. James II, another Stuart, another devout believer in kingship, was Catholic in a Protestant kingdom. He wasn't named Charles, but he carried the baggage. Within 3 years, his overt Catholicism and heavy-handed rule led to what became known as the Glorious Revolution. This time, Parliament didn't wait for war. It simply invited James's Protestant daughter Mary and her husband, William of Orange, to take the throne. They did. James fled. And just like that, the second civil crisis tied to the name Charles had claimed another Stuart king, this time through exile, not execution. The kicker? Charles II himself had once been nearly barred from the throne during the Exclusion Crisis, when Parliament tried to prevent a Catholic succession by excluding James. The debate over monarchy, legitimacy, and religion had become a recursive loop. The same name, the same fears, the same institutional anxiety dressed up in new arguments. And so 2 Stuart kings named Charles, one executed, one restored, formed the bookends of England's most dramatic rethinking of royal authority. They became involuntary symbols of the fragile balance between tradition and survival. One lost his head. One lost his heir's future. And somewhere between the scaffold and the exile, a monarchy was remade. But the strangest twist was still to come, because that very same royal bloodline, once severed, scattered, and politically radioactive, would eventually produce the monarch who finally unified the entire kingdom. 24. Regicide on the threshold of union. There's a bitter irony in the fact that Charles I, the most divisive monarch in English history, was also the grandfather of the woman who would finally stitch England and Scotland into one political body. His execution in 1649 symbolized the death of absolute monarchy. His daughter, Henrietta Anne, would marry into the French royal family, while his son Charles II would eventually return from exile to a kingdom more suspicious of kings than ever before. Fast forward just under 60 years, and a new monarch reigns. Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart line, the daughter of Charles I's second son, James II. She is not dramatic. She is not particularly dynamic, but she is critical. Because in 1707, under Queen Anne's rule, the Acts of Union were signed, merging the separate kingdoms of England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain. It wasn't inevitable. Union had been discussed, fought over, abandoned, revived, and mistrusted by both sides for decades. But Anne's reign, after centuries of wars, executions, and political chess, happened to fall at a rare moment of relative political alignment. The union was passed not through force or conquest, but negotiation. Some called it peace. Others, a financial transaction dressed up as patriotism. Still, the union happened. And the monarch who oversaw it was descended from the king whose head had been publicly removed as a statement against royal arrogance. The symbolism was rich. Anne, unlike her grandfather, didn't demand obedience. She ruled in consultation with Parliament, oversaw the emergence of a two-party system, and presided over a new national identity that was still trying to understand what British meant. But beneath the constitutional calm, there lingered the ghosts of civil war. Her own father, James II, had been exiled for his faith. Her brother, the so-called Old Pretender, was still waiting in exile, hoping to return. So there it was, a single dynasty producing a beheaded king and the Queen of Union, separated by just 2 generations. A royal lineage that went from symbolizing tyranny to symbolizing compromise. And all of it carried by bloodlines that had been supposed to end. What makes it stranger is how cleanly the timeline folds. 1649, execution of a king. 1707, union of 2 crowns into 1 kingdom. A death sentence and a political marriage, sitting like matched bookends on either side of a changing world. But if you thought the Stuart line was done collecting bizarre twists, the next event would remind everyone that royal legitimacy still had one great vulnerability: birth. Or rather, who witnessed it? 25. 2 warming pan babies and baby rumors. In 1688, Queen Mary of Modena, wife of James II, gave birth to a baby boy, James Francis Edward Stuart. He was healthy, alive, and male. In any other royal year, this would have been a triumph. But in 1688, it was a problem. Because England was largely Protestant. And James II, his father, was not only openly Catholic, he was deeply unpopular. The birth of a Catholic male heir meant that, for the first time in decades, the prospect of a Catholic dynasty returning to the throne was no longer hypothetical. It was imminent. Which is why rumors began circulating almost immediately. The baby wasn't real, or rather, not the right baby. According to some, the child had died during birth. In the most infamous version of the tale, a substitute baby had been smuggled into the Queen's bedchamber in a warming pan. A kind of hollow metal pan used to warm beds. The idea was that a common child had been swapped in to fake the birth of a Catholic heir. The story was absurd. Dozens of witnesses had been present, but the political timing made it believable. The Protestant public, already primed to distrust James II, latched onto the rumor with ferocity. It became the conspiracy theory of the century, and, conveniently, it gave cover to what happened next, the Glorious Revolution, in which James II was deposed and replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. But the warming pan baby myth didn't die with the Stuarts. A century later, George III, another royal child, was born amid whispers that he too had been swapped, this time because of apparent health issues. In both cases, birth became a matter of public speculation. Biology wasn't enough. You needed narrative credibility, and when that failed, people reached for folklore. Because in monarchy, legitimacy doesn't come from DNA. It comes from belief. And nothing tests belief like a locked bedchamber, a royal birth, and a warming pan carried at the wrong time. 26. The Queen of 17. Dead children and a barren throne. By the time Queen Anne died in 1714, she had outlived every one of her children. All 17 of them. Some died in the womb, others days or weeks after birth, and a few made it far enough to be given titles and futures before vanishing into premature graves. One after another. 17. In the national imagination, this detail lingers like fog on palace windows. It is statistically grim, emotionally devastating, and politically disastrous. Anne's reign was many things. The founding chapter of Great Britain, a time of expanding empire, rising party politics, and major military campaigns. But above all, it was haunted by the silence of a royal nursery. To the public, Anne was a figure of stability. She ruled during the War of the Spanish Succession, presided over the Act of Union between England and Scotland, and helped anchor the shifting sands of post-revolutionary monarchy. But behind the public image was a private woman physically worn down by relentless loss. The numbers alone are numbing. 17 pregnancies over 17 years, resulting in 5 stillbirths, 7 miscarriages, and 5 live births, none of whom lived past the age of 11. Her longest surviving child, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, was sickly from birth and died in 1700 at age 11, just when it seemed he might survive long enough to take the throne one day. He was the last serious hope for a straightforward Protestant succession. Anne's personal tragedies created a national crisis. With no heir, Parliament was forced to plan ahead, far ahead, into family trees many citizens had never heard of. The result was the Act of Settlement in 1701, which bypassed dozens of closer Catholic claimants and named Sophia of Hanover, a granddaughter of James III, as the future monarch. When Sophia died shortly before Anne, her son George Ludwig took her place, becoming George I of Britain. That's how the throne passed to the House of Hanover, through the womb-shaped hole left by Anne's childless body. A woman whose entire reign was defined by a desire to preserve Protestant legitimacy died with nothing to show for it but a succession law, a continental cousin, and a dynasty that would redefine the monarchy. But the eeriness lingers in more than law. Because Anne's failures weren't just medical, they felt almost mythic. She was the queen who had unified kingdoms into a single entity, and yet she couldn't unify her own bloodline into a single surviving child. Her crown was whole. Her family tree was a dead branch. Historians have debated the cause: autoimmune disease, lupus, hormonal imbalances, or perhaps the stress of near-constant pregnancy. But none of those explanations quite answers the haunting pattern. Not just miscarriage, but repetition. Not just stillbirths, but false starts, over and over again, like some cruel script was being followed to the letter. And yet, Anne's childlessness didn't stop history. It redirected it. The monarchy survived, but only by skipping halfway across Europe to find a new Protestant candidate. The people got a king. The throne stayed intact. But something else was lost: the emotional bridge between the Tudor-Stuart past and the Hanoverian future. The warm line of succession became cold policy. 17 deaths, 1 crown, 0 heirs. It was as if fate had allowed Anne to birth a country, but not an heir. And the great irony? The line that would take over the monarchy came not from Anne, nor from any of Henry VIII's surviving children, but from Margaret Tudor, Henry's long-overlooked sister, whose bloodline had patiently waited in Scotland for over a century, quietly preparing to unite the crowns. 27. The look-alike cousins, who never met as kings. In most family reunions, someone ends up standing in the corner, unnoticed, sipping something lukewarm and waiting for their moment. In the grand saga of the Tudor succession, that person was Margaret Tudor. While her brother Henry VIII lit bonfires of political and theological upheaval in England, Margaret's path was more traditional, at first. She married James IV of Scotland, a political alliance intended to secure peace between two historically combative kingdoms. She moved north, produced heirs, and watched from the periphery as her brother's marital exploits dismantled the Catholic Church in England. She wasn't the star of the show, but her descendants would be. Margaret's great-grandson, James VI of Scotland, bore a striking resemblance to his English cousins, both in appearance and in ambition. And by the end of Elizabeth I's childless reign, he had quietly positioned himself as the most logical heir to the English throne. The Tudor line, despite its many twists and dramatic U-turns, had reached a dead end. There were other claimants, of course, closer ones, arguably, but they were Catholic. And after decades of religious whiplash, England was not about to go back. James VI had 2 key qualifications: Protestantism and blood. He was the great-grandson of Margaret Tudor, meaning he was descended from Henry VII through the female line, not a direct route. But with Anne, Mary, and Elizabeth all dead and childless, it was the only one still open. And so, in 1603, James VI of Scotland became James I of England, the first monarch to rule both kingdoms simultaneously. The union of the crowns. One man, two thrones. Not a political merger yet, but a dynastic preview of what would come a century later under Queen Anne. What makes it all so oddly poetic is that this wasn't some grand plan. The English monarchy didn't groom James. Elizabeth Wursters never publicly named him her heir. The transition was peaceful not because it was deliberate, but because it was inevitable. The main Tudor trunk had rotted. The surviving branch, Margaret's line, had simply waited, quietly growing in the north. And when it finally bore fruit, it produced a monarch who was everything Elizabeth wasn't. Male, married, prolific in children, and fervently convinced of his own divine right. James III would go on to sponsor the King James Bible, survive the gunpowder plot, and father a dynasty that would both unite and unravel the kingdoms in turns. But the origin story of his English reign? It was a coincidence of marriage, timing, and attrition. The daughter no one remembered gave birth to the dynasty no one could forget. And yet even in this triumph, the pattern persisted. Because once James came south, he brought with him not only a crown, but a deeply ingrained fear of something darker. Not politics, not treason, but witchcraft. And one stormy voyage would be all it took to turn that fear into national obsession. 28. A prophecy that accidentally came true. Backwards. The Tudor dynasty was founded on shaky logic and absolute certainty, a paradox that seemed to define everything Henry VIII touched. But buried inside the logic of his first marriage was a very old fear, the fear of divine punishment, not from wars, not from revolts, but from marrying the wrong woman. More specifically, marrying the wrong widow. Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had previously been married to his older brother Arthur. Their union was brief, only a few months before Arthur died, and its consummation was left as a mystery. Catherine insisted it had never been consummated, making her eligible to marry Henry under canon law. The Pope agreed. The marriage proceeded. But years later, as Catherine failed to produce a male heir and Henry's restlessness grew, the king began to rewrite the story. He claimed the marriage had been invalid all along, that by marrying his brother's widow, he had broken Leviticus 20:21. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. A verse that suddenly became very convenient when Henry decided he needed a new wife, and Rome wouldn't grant him an annulment. Thus began Henry's theological case for annulment, the break from the Catholic Church, the creation of the Church of England, and the chain reaction that would redefine Europe. All because Henry decided the Bible told him his marriage was cursed. Here's the irony. If you take the logic of the curse seriously, if marrying your brother's widow guarantees dynastic failure, then history somehow managed to reverse engineer it into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the only child of Henry and Catherine who survived was Mary I, a woman who would eventually inherit the throne, rule as a Catholic queen, and burn with the fire of someone desperate to undo the Protestant legacy her father began. The curse, in a way, did not prevent an heir. It produced one. Just not the heir Henry wanted. And the heirs Henry did want, Edward VI, son of Jane Seymour and the future male Tudor line, all died out within a generation. His longed-for Protestant dynasty collapsed. It was not the child of Anne Boleyn or Jane Seymour who preserved the Tudors. It was the child of the supposedly cursed union, the one he tried to erase. So was the prophecy right, or was it just operating on a time delay? The problem with interpreting religious text as political commentary is that it always comes with a built-in boomerang. If Catherine's marriage was cursed, then why did her daughter ascend to the throne? If Anne Boleyn was the solution, then why did her daughter die childless, closing the Tudor line? The curse didn't fall on the first marriage. It fell on the second, and the third, and the fourth, all the way down the line. By the time the Stuarts took over, Henry's theological posturing looked less like divine insight and more like dynastic sabotage. His fear of divine punishment, wrapped in the language of Scripture and obsession with male heirs, had reshaped the kingdom's religious identity, upended centuries of tradition, and burned bridges that future monarchs would spend generations trying to rebuild. And the cherry on top? The woman he divorced, dishonored, and buried far from her husband's tomb is the only one whose daughter actually inherited the throne. The curse Henry thought he was escaping? He ran directly into it, backwards. And speaking of curses, the next monarch in line didn't just fear spiritual consequences. James VI of Scotland, the first Stuart King of England, feared something far more tangible. Women in league with the devil, calling storms out of thin air. And one terrifying voyage would be all it took to confirm his worst suspicions. 29. The Scottish King, obsessed with witchcraft. Then his ship almost sank. When James VI of Scotland set sail for Denmark in 1589 to collect his bride, Anne of Denmark, he expected a political marriage, a royal celebration, and a smooth return voyage. What he got instead was the weather, and a mind that quickly turned storms into omens, and omens into ideology. The journey itself was rough but survivable. But the return voyage from Denmark back to Scotland was nearly catastrophic. A fierce storm scattered James's fleet and forced the royal couple to seek shelter in Norway. Ships were damaged, schedules were delayed, and for James, a man already steeped in the anxieties of divine order and celestial authority, the whole ordeal felt unnatural. He began to suspect that the storm hadn't come from the sea. It had come from witches. Back in Denmark, similar storms had disrupted Anne's initial attempt to reach Scotland. Danish authorities had already blamed the bad weather on a coven of witches in Copenhagen. Trials had been held, confessions extracted. James took those stories with him across the North Sea and brought them home like diplomatic baggage. Once back in Scotland, he began what would become one of the most notorious witch-hunting episodes in British history. In 1590, the North Berwick witch trials kicked off with alarming force. Over 70 people were accused of conspiring with the devil to kill the king by raising a storm. Confessions included allegations of sailing in sieves, sending demonic cats to climb onto ships, and chanting incantations while standing in churchyards at midnight. One woman allegedly claimed the devil himself had promised her James would die by shipwreck, a detail that, once confessed, was enough to doom everyone involved. James, unusually, personally supervised many aspects of the trials. This wasn't detached royal policy. It was a vendetta wrapped in theology. He saw himself as a new Solomon, wise and anointed, uniquely equipped to spot Satan's agents. He even wrote a book, Demonology, a how-to guide on identifying witches, defending the realm, and preserving divine monarchy. And all of it, the book, the trials, the ideology, stemmed from a single storm on a royal honeymoon. The North Berwick affair wasn't an isolated case. It launched a cultural wave of witch paranoia in Scotland that would last decades, culminating in mass trials, torture, and executions. James's fear metastasized into state policy. It's tempting to mock the superstition, to write it off as medieval panic. But underneath the myth-making is something far more modern, a political system responding to instability with fear, and fear with violence. James would later mellow on witchcraft. The older he got, the less he seemed interested in devil chasing. But the damage was done. The pattern had formed. A storm at sea had birthed a storm in policy. And it didn't end with James, because while he feared the sea, his female counterparts were just as doomed by time. One queen would rule for 9 days, another would hold a kingdom for 9 years, and both would leave the crown prematurely. One through betrayal, the other through forced abdication. Different thrones, same pattern, same strange number, 30. The 9 days and 9 years queens. If you were a Tudor-era queen with a reign measured in nines, it likely meant your story didn't end well. One ruled England for 9 days. The other ruled Scotland for 9 years. Both were young. Both were intelligent. Both were used as political chess pieces by the men around them. And both were ultimately deposed, imprisoned, and executed. Their brief reigns turned into cautionary tales, symbols of how fragile female power could be in kingdoms defined by male paranoia. First, there's Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen. She wasn't born to rule. She wasn't even meant to be in the conversation. But in 1553, when Edward VI lay dying and desperate to preserve the Protestant Reformation, he named his cousin Jane, not his half-sisters Mary or Elizabeth, as his successor. It made sense on paper. Jane was Protestant, compliant, and already married into a politically ambitious family. She ticked every ideological box for the Protestant elite. And so, when Edward died, she was declared queen and brought to the Tower of London, not as a prisoner, but as a monarch. And then, the world shifted. Mary Tudor, Edward's Catholic half-sister, did not take kindly to being skipped. Within 9 days, she had rallied an army, seized control, and marched on London. The country, not as Protestant as Edward's advisors believed, largely backed her. Jane was arrested, declared a usurper, and imprisoned in the same tower where she had just been crowned. She was only 16. Jane's brief reign was undone by overconfidence, by her father-in-law's ambition, and by the political naivete of the council that placed her there. She hadn't seized the crown, she had it dropped onto her head, and then yanked away. Mary initially spared Jane, possibly out of recognition that she had been a pawn. But when Thomas Wyatt launched a Protestant rebellion, Jane's name surfaced again as a potential figurehead. That was enough. She was executed in 1554, her body laid to rest just yards from where she had once ruled. Then there's Mary, Queen of Scots, whose story ran longer and messier. Mary became Queen of Scotland as an infant. Her father, James V, died just days after her birth, and she inherited the crown at 6 days old. For years she was raised in France, betrothed to the French heir Francis II, and eventually became Queen Consort of France, briefly. When Francis died young, Mary returned to Scotland, a Catholic monarch in an increasingly Protestant land. Her reign was technically 9 years, 1561 to 1567. But the first part was ceremonial, the latter catastrophic. Mary made a series of spectacularly bad political choices. Marrying her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who then turned on her, witnessing his murder, allegedly arranged by her next husband James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, then marrying Bothwell, the suspected killer. That union ruined her politically. Nobles revolted. Mary was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. She fled to England believing her cousin Elizabeth I would offer protection. She miscalculated. Mary spent the next 19 years imprisoned, suspected of plotting against Elizabeth. Catholic powers in Europe saw her as the rightful Queen of England. She became the figurehead for rebellions, rumors, and assassination plots, whether she liked it or not. Eventually, intercepted letters sealed her fate. Elizabeth signed the warrant. Mary was executed in 1587. 2 queens. 2 dramatically short reigns. One 9 days, one 9 years. Neither ended with glory. Both ended with the same sentence: a crown that never fit. But what's strange isn't just that both reigned briefly. It's how closely their fates rhyme. Both were teenagers or barely out of it. Both were born into complex lines of succession. Both were declared queens against rising political tides. Both were sacrificed, one to stability, the other to security. And both became, in the long run, far more important dead than alive. Jane Grey became a Protestant martyr. Mary, Queen of Scots, became the tragic Catholic heroine, and mother of the king who would unite the crowns. Their reigns were short, but their shadows stretched across generations. And speaking of dynasties collapsing under the weight of their final battles, two major royal houses, the Yorkists and the Jacobites, both met their doom not in palace coups or quiet abdications, but in battle, open fields, decisive defeats, and final chapters written not in courts, but in blood and exile. 31. Two royal houses, ended in the same kind of battle. For all its trappings of ceremony, monarchy often ends not in graceful exits, but in mud, steel, and the thud of horses going down. Some dynasties die in bed, some at the scaffold, and some on the battlefield trying to win one last time. That was the fate of the House of York in 1485 and the House of Stuart, at least the Jacobite claim to it, in 1746. Two royal causes, two climactic battles, two complete collapses. First, the Battle of Bosworth Field, 22 August 1485. Richard III, last king of the House of York, faced the forces of Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant with questionable pedigree, and an even more questionable number of troops. Richard had seized the throne 2 years earlier after the mysterious disappearance of his nephews, the princes in the Tower, and spent his short reign defending it against constant whisper campaigns and noble unrest. At Bosworth, Richard famously led a desperate cavalry charge directly at Henry himself, hoping to end the battle by killing the rival commander. It was a bold, cinematic move, and it failed. Richard was unhorsed, overwhelmed, and killed. His body was slung over a horse and buried hastily. The crown, allegedly found in a thorn bush, was handed to Henry, who became Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. The battle didn't just kill a king, it ended the Plantagenet era. The Wars of the Roses were over, at least on paper, and England had a new monarch whose claim was less about blood and more about victory. Fast forward 261 years to Culloden Moor, 16 April 1746. Here, it was Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, leading the Jacobite uprising, hoping to restore the House of Stuart to the British throne. His army, composed largely of Highland Scots, had surged dramatically through Scotland and into England. But at Culloden, they faced the full might of the British government army under the Duke of Cumberland. It was a rout. The Jacobites were outnumbered, poorly supplied, and crushed within an hour. Charles fled. The romantic cause of Stuart restoration died with it. The Highlands were brutally suppressed. The traditional clan system was dismantled, and the last serious attempt to reclaim the throne for the Stuarts dissolved into folklore, songs, and exile. Two dynasties, two battles, two endings. What's chilling is the symmetry. Both the Yorkists and the Jacobite Stuarts made their final stands not through diplomacy or legal wrangling, but on open fields. Both lost everything in a single day. Both had leaders who believed, wrongly, that one great charge could change history. And in both cases, the victors went on to redefine the kingdom. The Tudors launched the Reformation. The Hanoverians consolidated a British state tied more closely than ever to Parliament. Monarchies often prefer to end things quietly. But when they don't, they tend to go out like this, violently, symbolically, and decisively. Next came a battle not just over a throne, but over an entire island, a river called the Boyne, where one battle didn't just decide a king's fate, it permanently rewrote the politics of Ireland too. 32. The Irish battlefield that took two kings from two kingdoms. Some battles crown a king, others erase one. But the Battle of the Boyne, fought on 1 July 1690, did something stranger. It damaged two kings at once. One definitively lost. The other, though victorious, never fully recovered. And the island they fought over, Ireland, was left marked not just by the armies, but by a permanent division that outlasted both monarchs, both thrones, and, arguably, the entire age of divine right. The players were familiar. On one side, James II, the deposed Catholic King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. On the other, his son-in-law and replacement, William of Orange, Newly crowned King William III, alongside his wife, Mary II, James's Protestant daughter. To James, the Boyne was a chance at restoration. After being exiled during the Glorious Revolution of 1688, a coup so bloodless in England it's often remembered as more of a polite reshuffling, James sailed to Ireland, the one part of his former kingdoms where he still had support. Irish Catholics rallied to his cause, seeing in him a chance to roll back decades of plantation policy, religious repression, and foreign rule. To William, this wasn't just a dynastic squabble. It was a war of religion, identity, and continental alliances. France backed James. The Dutch and English backed William. The Pope awkwardly supported William too, because France was his bigger problem. Nothing about the Boyne was simple. Not then, not now. The battle itself took place along the River Boyne, near Drogheda. James's army was made up of Irish Catholics and French troops. William's forces were more diverse: Dutch, Danish, Huguenot, English Protestants. Both armies were sizable, the symbolism outsized. On the morning of the battle, William himself led the charge, fording the river under fire. He was grazed by a cannonball, a near miss that quickly became legend. His forces overwhelmed James's lines, and by the end of the day, the Jacobite army was retreating. James fled, again, this time earning the nickname Seamus and Chaka from his Irish allies. James the Coward. He would never see a crown again. William had won. The Protestant succession was secure, but the aftermath was far from clean. Though James's defeat was decisive, the broader conflict, known as the Williamite War in Ireland, dragged on for another year. And the Boyne's political legacy went far beyond military strategy. For Irish Protestants, it became a foundational myth, a triumph of civilization over tyranny, of liberty over popery. The Orange Order, founded over a century later, would adopt William as their icon. His image, astride a white horse, still rides in murals and marches across Northern Ireland to this day. But for Irish Catholics, the Boyne was a warning. It cemented the Protestant ascendancy, a political system where Catholics were second-class citizens in their own land. The penal laws soon followed. Religion became law, and the island's history spiraled into centuries of suspicion, resentment, and rebellion. And what of the kings? James II lived out his days in exile, pitied by some, mocked by others. A man born to rule, undone by stubbornness, and immortalized more for his absences than his acts. William III, despite winning, never quite escaped the shadow of his Dutch origins or his cold demeanor. He ruled effectively, but never belovedly. His marriage to Mary was childless. His legacy, while secure, was also sterile. The victory at the Boyne was real, but it was also the beginning of a deeper instability, not the end of one. Two kings entered the field. Neither truly left whole. And the land beneath them? Ireland carried the consequences, and still does. But the weather, oh, the weather had its own opinion. Because just as one battle seemed to decide two thrones, the wind itself would intervene in another royal drama, twice. Once to destroy an invading fleet, and once to escort one. Which begs the question, when the crown changes hands, is it politics, or just the weather's mood that day? 33. Two different monarchies saved by bad weather. England has always been an island nation with a complicated relationship to the sea, depending on it for trade, fearing it for invasion, and sometimes imagining that God controls the wind in her defense. Two events in particular hardened this idea into near myth: the destruction of the Spanish Armada in 1588, and the Glorious Revolution's wind-assisted arrival in 1688. In both cases, weather didn't just happen to play a role. It became a royal talking point, a divine footnote, and a signal that maybe the Almighty was keeping score. Start with 1588. Elizabeth Thirsk had reigned for 30 years. England was Protestant, officially, but the scars of Mary's reign still lingered. Across the Channel, Philip II of Spain, once married to Mary, now widowed, devoutly Catholic and furious, saw Elizabeth as a heretic and a usurper. The time had come to invade, depose, and restore England to Rome. He sent the Spanish Armada, one of the largest fleets the world had ever seen, up through the Channel. English forces, under Francis Drake, fought hard, with nimble ships and clever tactics. But it was the weather that finished the job. As the Armada tried to retreat north around Scotland and Ireland, storms scattered them. Ships were dashed on rocks, sunk in squalls, or forced far off course. Only a fraction made it back to Spain. Elizabeth declared victory not just by sword, but by sky. A medal was struck with the words, "He blew with his winds, and they were scattered." The weather, God's weather, had intervened. It was the perfect Protestant narrative. England was chosen, protected, ordained. Never mind that naval warfare, poor planning, and bad logistics played key roles. The storm got the credit, and the legend was born. Now jump to 1688, exactly 1 century later. James II, England's Catholic king, was rapidly losing support. His policies alienated Protestants. His new Catholic heir terrified Parliament. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, William of Orange, married to James's Protestant daughter Mary, was watching carefully. Parliament invited him to intervene. William prepared a fleet. The wind, at first, worked against him. But then, suddenly, it changed. A perfect east wind blew William's ships straight across the Channel, while James's navy, blocked by wind in the wrong direction, could not intercept. William landed unopposed in Torbay and marched inland. By the time James tried to rally support, the moment was gone. He fled. Parliament declared the throne vacant. William and Mary were offered a joint crown. Once again, the weather had chosen a Protestant monarch. The irony wasn't lost on propagandists. Just as storms had once crushed the Catholic Armada, fair winds now blessed the Protestant invasion. Divine intervention, via meteorology. The sea didn't just protect England. It made moral decisions. 2 centuries, 2 invasions, 2 religious crises. And both times the wind blew in favor of the Protestant regime. Coincidence? Probably. But history doesn't always care about probabilities. It cares about narratives. And the narrative here was irresistible. When England needed saving, the sky itself seemed to act. Of course, for the kings who ruled, divine endorsement could be fickle. Because even as the heavens appeared to favor them, they often ran into trouble here on earth, particularly from unexpected corners. And few things sting quite like a challenge from someone wearing a collar. Because for 2 very different kings named Henry, their greatest adversaries weren't foreign armies or rival claimants. They were churchmen, men of God who refused to bend, and whose deaths turned them into martyrs that haunted the crown for centuries. 34. 2 kings. Henry brought low by churchmen. If there's one thing English kings have never handled gracefully, it's opposition from someone wearing a robe instead of a sword. 2 Henrys, centuries apart, learned this the hard way, each facing off against a man of the cloth who refused to bow to royal will. In both cases, the result was more than just a political inconvenience. It was a legend, the kind of story that outlives everyone involved and still rattles around the rafters of cathedrals centuries later. The first of these royal clerical standoffs came in the 12th century with Henry II and his former friend, Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. What started as a strategic appointment turned into one of the most infamous collisions of crown and church in medieval Europe. Henry appointed Becket in 1162, assuming he would be a loyal ally in the king's push to control the church. They had been close. Becket had served as Henry's chancellor, sharing meals, jokes, even hunting trips. But once Becket wore the mitre, he transformed. He turned ascetic, devout, and most of all, obstinate. The core of the feud? Jurisdiction. Henry wanted clerics accused of crimes to be tried in royal courts. Becket insisted they remain under church law. It wasn't just a legal dispute. It was a tug-of-war over moral supremacy. Henry saw a kingdom. Becket saw a soul. Their feud escalated. Becket fled into exile. Papal negotiations floundered. And then came the moment of legend. In a fit of rage, Henry is said to have shouted, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Whether those exact words were spoken is debatable, but the effect was not. 4 knights, believing they were doing the king's will, rode to Canterbury and murdered Becket in the cathedral. At the altar, the shock was instant. Becket became a martyr almost overnight. Miracles were reported. Pilgrims flocked to his tomb. And Henry, the powerful Plantagenet monarch, was forced to walk barefoot through the streets of Canterbury, letting monks flog him as penance. Becket had won. In death, he was stronger than Henry in life. Now, fast forward 4 centuries. Enter Henry VIII, a king with another Becket-shaped problem, this time in the form of Sir Thomas More, his one-time Lord Chancellor. More wasn't a bishop, but he was one of the most learned and respected lay theologians of the day. Like Becket, he had been close to his king, and like Becket, he refused to bend when the king demanded moral compromise. The issue was, again, the crown's reach over the church. Henry wanted an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. The Pope said no. Henry broke from Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and demanded his subjects recognize the legitimacy of his new marriage to Anne Boleyn. More refused. He didn't lead a rebellion. He didn't preach sedition. He simply stayed silent, refusing to endorse what he believed to be an unlawful marriage and a spiritual coup. But silence, in Henry's England, was treason. More was imprisoned in the Tower of London. After a drawn-out trial, he was convicted on questionable evidence. Before his execution, he famously declared, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." Like Becket, he became a martyr. Like Becket, he was later canonized. And like Becket, his moral stand forced a king to confront the uncomfortable idea that some power lies beyond royal reach. What makes these 2 stories resonate so eerily is the repetition. 2 Henrys, both powerful, intelligent, and determined to rule without interference. 2 men of faith, both once allies, transformed by conscience into symbols of resistance. And in both cases, the crown won in the short term. But history remembers the churchmen more vividly. The message is clear. In England, the clash between throne and altar isn't just institutional, it's existential. Kings may write the laws, but saints write the stories. And even the buildings remember. Because just down the road from Parliament, in a church filled with crowns and coronations, lies a collection of bones and secrets. Westminster Abbey crowned kings, but it also buried rivals. It celebrated divine right, and quietly tucked away the politically inconvenient. A sacred vault of contradictions, sealed with incense and dynastic compromise. 35. The Abbey, that crowned and uncrowned. If the British monarchy had a soul, it would probably live somewhere beneath the soaring vaults of Westminster Abbey, a place where kings are made, queens are buried, and uncomfortable truths are quietly swallowed by polished stone. For nearly 1,000 years, this one building has been a theater of legitimacy and contradiction. And what it chooses to display, or conceal, says more about the monarchy than any coronation speech ever could. Start with what's obvious. Westminster Abbey is where nearly every English and later British monarch has been crowned since William the Conqueror in 1066. The rituals are as ancient as they are precise. The oil, the orb, the oath. It's theater, yes, but theater with teeth. Once the crown touches the head, the transformation is complete. A human becomes a sovereign. A mere ruler becomes a divinely sanctioned monarch. But behind the altars and choirs, the abbey holds a much murkier role, because while it anoints the chosen, it also buries the inconvenient. Take the bones of the princes in the tower. In 1674, 2 skeletons were discovered beneath a staircase in the White Tower at the Tower of London. They were believed to be Edward V and his younger brother Richard, the lost sons of Edward IV, presumed murdered during the brief reign of Richard III. With no definitive proof and no will to investigate further, the bones were quietly moved to Westminster Abbey and interred with royal honors. There was no trial, no inquest, just a tomb with an inscription that hints but never confirms. It was as if the abbey was saying, "We don't know what happened, but we know where this story needs to end." Then there's Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic queen executed by her Protestant cousin, Elizabeth III, after decades of political tension and imprisonment. Mary died condemned, but was later reburied at Westminster Abbey, next to Elizabeth. The 2 women whose rivalry defined an era now lie within steps of each other, opposite sides of the religious divide, forced into architectural proximity. In life, their courts were at war. In death, their tombs are awkward neighbors. And there's more. Empress Matilda, never formally crowned but considered by many the rightful queen during the 12th century civil war known as the Anarchy, has descendants buried in the abbey, even though she herself is not. Richard II, deposed and likely murdered, lies entombed here with a monument that restores royal dignity his enemies tried to erase. Oliver Cromwell, the man who abolished the monarchy altogether, was buried in the abbey, only to be exhumed, hanged, and decapitated after the Restoration. His head was displayed on a spike. His body? Gone. The abbey once held him, and then unheld him. It is a place of coronation, yes, but also of correction. Westminster Abbey is not neutral. It curates royal history with surgical precision. It buries some monarchs in splendor, others in modesty, and some, like George III's children, or Queen Anne's 17 lost infants, in near anonymity. What does that say about the crown? That legitimacy is not just about law or blood or victory, it's about memory. And memory is fragile, mutable, curated. Just because a king is crowned doesn't mean he's remembered. And just because a queen is buried there doesn't mean her story is told. So next time you see a royal coronation on TV, with choirs singing and robes trailing, remember that just beneath those stone floors are the bones of failed kings, forgotten queens, and secrets wrapped in velvet. And somewhere in the chapel vaults, the air still echoes with the names that should have ruled, but never did. Like Anne Boleyn, her daughter became queen. Her ghost, some say, still walks. And her story would haunt not just Elizabeth, but the very calendar of the crown. 36. Anne Boleyn's ghost. And Elizabeth I's birthday. Some mothers leave behind wisdom. Some leave behind heirlooms. Anne Boleyn left behind a kingdom, and a ghost that seemed to walk not just the halls of the Tower, but the royal calendar itself. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, was born on 7 September 1533, to the mixed emotions of a kingdom still waiting for a male heir. Anne, second wife to Henry VIII, was already controversial, already powerful, and already walking a tightrope. When Elizabeth was born, the disappointment was palpable. No prince, just another daughter. But Henry pressed on, declaring Elizabeth legitimate, and Anne his rightful queen. For a while. Then came May 1536. Anne Boleyn was arrested, accused of a litany of crimes that even her enemies found hard to believe, and executed on 19 May. The same calendar that marked her daughter's birth now bore the date of her death. A neat, bitter symmetry that Elizabeth would never be able to escape. Unlike her half-sister Mary, Elizabeth never publicly acknowledged her mother's execution. There were no memorials, no speeches, no court remembrances. But the silence itself was suspicious. The court had long memories, and so did the astrologers, chroniclers, and servants who whispered about omens and signs. May, in Elizabeth's court, became an anxious month. Political crises often clustered around it, as if her mother's ghost were knocking at the windows. The superstitions grew. Even without a public observance, people noted the dates. Elizabeth herself, meticulous about image and legacy, maintained a curious distance. No one in her inner circle was foolish enough to bring it up, but every year the Tower Guards paid extra attention in May, just in case. And then there were the sightings. Anne Boleyn's ghost was reported all over England, from Blickling Hall, her birthplace, to the Tower of London, where she was executed. She was seen headless, or dressed in white, or walking with a single candle, depending on who was telling the story. But the most persistent tales placed her around the 19th of May, returning to the scene of her death. The mother, it seemed, could never leave. Neither could the story. For Elizabeth, this wasn't just superstition, it was politics. Her entire reign was shadowed by the strange, almost cursed legacy of her mother. Anne had been the catalyst for the break with Rome, the second wife who destroyed the first, the Protestant temptress who became queen, then traitor. And yet, without Anne's rise and fall, Elizabeth would never have ruled. This paradox, being the product of a scandal, and yet the architect of a golden age, defined her reign. Elizabeth styled herself the Virgin Queen, married to England, as if to break the cycle of dynastic obsession that had swallowed her mother. But she was always Anne's daughter, sharp, politically brilliant, suspicious of courtiers, wary of marriage. She wore her mother's ring. She read her letters. She restored some of her Boleyn relatives to court. But never, not once, did she openly celebrate her mother's life. Instead, Anne lived on in the margins. A portrait in a corridor, a family crest above a doorway, a date on a calendar. May remained marked, not with flowers or processions, but with caution. Some historians have suggested that Elizabeth's wariness of May was entirely strategic. Why risk glorifying a woman the crown had once executed? Why invite Catholic propagandists to dredge up old accusations? Why draw attention to the fact that the Queen's mother was beheaded for treason? And yet, the ghost lingered. Anne Boleyn, mother of a queen, symbol of Protestant ascendancy, and sacrificial lamb of Tudor politics, became England's most enduring royal phantom, not just in legend, but in legacy. She wasn't simply remembered. She haunted the very structure of the monarchy that claimed to have buried her. And her daughter, Elizabeth Thirsk, would go on to rule for 45 years. But every spring, May arrived. The blossoms opened. The court grew restless. And the ghost of Anne Boleyn walked once more. And then there was Edward IV, who, unlike Anne, believed the heavens favored him, especially around Easter. It was his lucky season, or so he thought. Until one April, the king who saw spring as his divine ally suddenly dropped dead, and the kingdom he thought he'd secured began to unravel before his body was even cold. 37. The king who died on his own. Lucky Day. Edward IV was a king who believed in timing. A warrior king from the House of York, Edward had clawed his way to power during the Wars of the Roses, a brutal dynastic conflict where rightful king was more of a job title than a bloodline. And among all the dates on his royal calendar, Easter and Palm Sunday held a special place. Those were his lucky days. Palm Sunday in particular had become a talisman of fortune. Edward had won the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, on Palm Sunday 1461. That victory cemented his claim to the throne. From that day forward, springtime became more than a season. It was divine confirmation. April was his ally, Easter his omen. So when Edward died suddenly on 9th April 1483, shortly after Easter, the irony was thick enough to drown in. The king whose reign began in spring's glory ended in its shadow. His death wasn't the result of battle or rebellion. It came quickly and with little warning. And while the exact cause remains debated, some suggest pneumonia, others apoplexy, the effect was immediate. The kingdom slid into chaos. Edward had spent his reign building the appearance of stability. He'd restored royal authority after years of civil war. He had 2 living sons, Edward and Richard, poised to inherit. And yet, like so many English kings before him, he hadn't counted on what happened when he was gone. At the time of his death, his eldest son, Edward V, was just 12 years old, too young to rule, too old to be ignored. Edward IV had appointed his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector. But Richard wasn't interested in protecting anything except his own claim. Within weeks, Richard had moved the young king and his brother into the Tower of London, supposedly for their safety. They were never seen again. Edward IV's carefully balanced court fractured. Old alliances shattered. Richard declared himself Richard III, claiming the boys were illegitimate. And the Yorkist cause, once triumphant, began its slow implosion. It's hard not to see Edward's death as a cruel reversal. The dates that once signaled his rise now marked the beginning of his dynasty's collapse. Palm Sunday had crowned him. April had blessed him. And then, just as suddenly, April turned. Historians have long pointed to Edward IV's sudden death as a turning point in late medieval England. If he had lived even a few more years, his son might have reached maturity. The succession might have proceeded peacefully. The Tudors, waiting in the wings, might never have risen. But fate, or perhaps just bad luck, intervened. What makes Edward's story so eerily compelling is how it mirrors a broader Tudor-era theme, that success in life means nothing without control over death. The king who had won England on a spring day couldn't hold it when the same season came back around. The same dates that made him legendary also made him vulnerable. And his death didn't just remove a king, it removed a plan, a design, a future. The message was clear. Even if you win the throne, you can't schedule history. And the proof of that would soon show itself in stone. Because the Tower of London, where Edward's sons disappeared, wasn't just a prison. It was a pattern. And far to the north, another royal tower had its own chilling reputation. One that also involved child prisoners, royal turmoil, and the unsettling feeling that towers, like time, never forget. 38. 2 royal towers, associated with child prisoners. There's something inherently uneasy about towers in royal history. They're meant to symbolize strength, stone monuments to dynastic permanence and authority. But more often than not, they become prisons. Tombs without the ceremony. Symbols not of power, but of fear. And nowhere is this clearer than in the way 2 royal towers, one in England, one in Scotland, have become eerily linked by a single chilling motif. Children behind stone walls, waiting for a crown they would never wear. First, the Tower of London. By the 15th century, it was already infamous as a royal fortress and occasional death trap. But its darkest legend crystallized during the reign of Richard III with the disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. In 1483, after the death of their father, Edward IV, the boys, aged 12 and 9, were lodged in the tower under the protection of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. That was standard practice. The tower, then, was not just a prison. It was also a royal residence. Crowns had been kept there, monarchs had slept there, even celebrated before coronations. It wasn't the tower's architecture that was sinister. It was what happened behind the walls. The boys were seen playing in the gardens at first, smiling, talking to servants, waiting for Edward's coronation. And then, slowly, the sightings stopped. First, the elder brother vanished from view, then the younger. Rumors spread like fire across London. Whispers of murder, suffocation, poison, a plot. But no body, no trial, just silence and a throne newly claimed by their uncle, now Richard III. The tower became more than just a building after that. It became a mythic trap, especially for the young. A place where royal blood was not sacred but disposable. And then, nearly 2 centuries later, workmen remodeling the tower in 1674 uncovered a wooden box under a staircase. Inside were 2 small skeletons. Charles II, never one to ignore a good story, ordered them buried in Westminster Abbey under the names of the lost princes. Were they really Edward and Richard? No one knows. But the story fit so well, it didn't seem to matter. Now, pivot north to Scotland. Edinburgh Castle, perched on a rock that seems to claw at the sky, had its own version of the tower, specifically a chamber known as David's Tower, named for King David II, but better remembered as a place of confinement during Scotland's own dynastic chaos. In the 15th century, during a violent period of internal power struggles, the castle played host to a royal child, James II of Scotland, brought there after the murder of his father. Aged just 7, James was kept under heavy guard, effectively imprisoned by rival factions who ruled in his name. While not a captive in the traditional sense, he had no freedom, no real power, and no protection from the political bloodbath happening around him. Years later, Mary, Queen of Scots, would also place her infant son, James VI, under protection in the castle during a time of civil unrest. He too became a symbol of divided loyalties. To some, he was the future of Protestant Scotland. To others, just a pawn in a very dangerous game. And though he would survive and go on to unite the crowns of England and Scotland, his early years were shaped by confinement, fear, and plots stacked like daggers behind every door. What ties these 2 towers together is more than just stone and story. It's the uncomfortable truth that royal childhood is often a political liability, not a protected status. The very blood that makes a child heir to the throne also makes them a target, either to be manipulated, silenced, or simply removed. The pattern is impossible to ignore. Child monarchs confined by the very castles meant to defend them. Towers as sanctuaries turned traps. Guardians who became jailers. And in both cases, long after the children were gone, the buildings themselves became haunted. Not by ghosts, necessarily, but by memory, by implication, by the echo of small footsteps in 2 large rooms. And the echoes didn't stop with the princes and child kings. Because centuries later, one Scottish king would take the Bible a little too literally. He saw himself not just as a ruler of men, but a chosen one, a new David, an English Solomon, a monarch of divine insight and sacred mission. And, fittingly, when the storms came to sink his ships, it wasn't sailors or generals who took the blame. It was witches. 39. The Stuart king, who thought he was an Israelite king. It takes a particular kind of monarch to believe he's the second coming of King David. But James VI of Scotland, later James III of England, wasn't interested in merely ruling his kingdoms. He wanted to script them into biblical prophecy, a kingdom of God on earth, a royal mission with the faint scent of incense and apocalyptic thunder. This was a man who didn't just read scripture, he inhabited it. He believed his lineage and reign were divinely ordained, his authority sanctified not only by coronation rites but by Old Testament metaphors. He often likened himself to David, the shepherd king, and Solomon, the wise ruler. But unlike those figures, James had one thing they didn't: a printing press. And he used it. James commissioned the King James Bible, one of the most influential translations in the English-speaking world, in part to consolidate his image as a unifier of realms and religions. The Bible wasn't just a text, it was a political manifesto dressed in sacred robes. But James's obsession with the divine had a shadow side. It made him paranoid, fearful, obsessed with witchcraft, which he saw not as folklore, but as active treason against God's chosen ruler, himself. In 1589, as James prepared to bring his Danish bride Anne of Denmark to Scotland, a storm nearly wrecked their return voyage. The winds were so fierce that many ships turned back. Anne was delayed. James himself was rattled. What should have been a romantic triumph became an existential crisis. James didn't see bad weather. He saw spiritual warfare. Not long after, a series of witch trials erupted in both Denmark and Scotland, fueled by James's own suspicions. He believed witches had conjured the storms to kill him. He even oversaw interrogations and wrote a book, Demonology, which laid out his views on sorcery, demons, and the dangers of diabolical plots against the crown. The North Berwick witch trials, which followed, saw dozens of people accused, some executed, based on flimsy evidence and royal anxiety. These trials were brutal, confused, and ultimately politically useful. James's paranoia gave him a license to purge, to reassert divine favor by hunting the devil's supposed agents. What's most eerie is how this divine self-image would outlive James himself. Long after his death, fringe groups, especially in the 19th century, would evolve his metaphors into actual theology. The British Israelite movement emerged, claiming that the British were literal descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, and that the monarchy had a divine, ancient role to play in world salvation. It sounds fringe because it is. But it wasn't obscure. It caught on. It influenced politics, colonial ideology, and even aspects of 20th century nationalism, all rooted, however faintly, in a king's self-flattering Bible study. James VI and I never met a metaphor he didn't like, but in dressing himself as David, he invited a kind of scrutiny that no crown can withstand forever. A divine king is only divine until it reigns, or until Parliament shows up, or until someone writes a better metaphor. Still, his legacy remains, written into scripture, etched into legal history, and echoed in those later mystics who saw Jerusalem in London fog. But history has a way of reversing expectations. Because the king who saw himself as a sacred Solomon unknowingly planted the seeds for a very British contradiction. A Protestant crown born from a Tudor queen who thought she was done with Scotland, until her great-grandson showed up to wear it. 40. A Tudor queen. Who created the Stuart king? Who replaced them? Dynasties aren't meant to be generous. They are built on exclusion, guarded by bloodlines, and enforced by brutal math. Only one crown, only one monarch, only one future. But the Tudor dynasty, for all its bluster and propaganda, came to an oddly poetic end, not with a final victorious heir, but with a quiet, forgotten sister whose descendants would rewrite the map of Britain. Her name was Margaret Tudor. She's not the Tudor you remember. That's by design. She wasn't the glamorous second wife of Henry VIII, the scandalous Anne Boleyn, or the tragic boy King Edward VI. She wasn't Mary, the Catholic queen, nor Elizabeth, the iconic Virgin Queen. Margaret, the elder sister of Henry VIII, was shipped north, married off to James IV of Scotland in 1503 as part of a peace treaty that naturally collapsed within a decade. James IV died fighting Margaret's brother Henry VIII at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. So much for peace. But Margaret remained in Scotland, where she played the dangerous game of royal widowhood, remarried badly, and spent the rest of her life watching the Scottish nobility tear itself apart over her son, James V. She died in relative obscurity, far from her famous English siblings, remembered more for her marital drama than her political insight. And yet, here's the twist, Margaret Tudor won. Because while Henry VIII spent his life tearing through wives in pursuit of a male heir, executing his friends, rewriting the country's religion, and fathering a dynasty of 3 deeply complicated monarchs, Edward VI, Mary I, Elizabeth I, none of his children had heirs, not one. The Tudor line, for all its fire and fury, burned out within a single generation after Henry's death. But Margaret's line, tucked away in Scotland, surviving rebellions, assassinations, and Protestant Catholic civil wars, endured. Her great-grandson, James VI of Scotland, would inherit the English throne in 1603 as James I of England, uniting the crowns after a century of bloodshed. It's a dynastic irony so rich it feels scripted. Henry VIII ignored Margaret in his succession planning. He disinherited his sister's descendants in favor of more controllable English nobles. He even passed laws trying to secure the throne for the children of his younger sister Mary Tudor, believing their marriages to Englishmen made them safer. But by the time Elizabeth lay dying with no heirs, every one of those preferred successors was gone. There was only one living descendant of Henry VII left, who could plausibly inherit both the Tudor bloodline and the crowns of England and Scotland. And it was Margaret's great-grandson, the child of a Stuart king, not a Tudor prince. A boy born of a line Henry had tried to erase. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, launching the Stuart dynasty, and eventually giving rise to a whole new kind of monarchy, one that would face revolutions, exiles, and global empires. He was literate, theological, awkward, obsessed with divine right and unification. He didn't just wear the crown, he wrote essays about it. But the crown he wore, both of them, only came to him because of a failed Tudor succession. Because 3 monarchs died childless. Because Margaret Tudor, the forgotten sister, had quietly seeded her bloodline into Scotland. It's the kind of historical coincidence that would make a genealogist weep with joy, and a Tudor spin doctor die of embarrassment. And yet, it perfectly fits the strange logic of royal history. The spare branch becomes the main line. The ignored marriage yields the next century. The sister exiled across the border becomes the ancestor of the future of Britain. Of course, there were those who saw this coming, sort of. Even in the 16th century, gossip swirled that Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, was cursed from the start. That marrying your brother's wife was inviting divine retribution. That any children from such a union would be doomed. But if that curse existed, it didn't just affect the children. It changed the entire course of the monarchy. 41. 2 queens who turned their husbands into legends. In the great hall of European royal myth-making, 2 women stand in opposite corners, cloaked not in jewels, but in reputation. One was French, the other Aquitanian. One ruled through bloodlines and poison rumors, the other through scandalous independence and sheer political gravity. But both, Catherine de' Medici and Eleanor of Aquitaine, managed to do what few queens ever could, turn their husbands into legends, and themselves into something close to folklore villains. Let's begin with Eleanor. Eleanor of Aquitaine was no passive bride. She inherited vast lands in southwestern France, married Louis VII of France, got bored, and then married Henry II of England, the man who would become the first Plantagenet king. The match was not just strategic, it was electric, volatile, and, eventually, dangerous. Henry II was a formidable ruler, but his marriage to Eleanor would define much of his political legacy. They had 8 children. Among them, Richard the Lionheart and John. Yes, that John. But Eleanor wasn't content with motherhood. She governed, she maneuvered, and eventually she rebelled. In her later years, Eleanor supported her sons' revolt against their father. She was imprisoned by Henry II for over a decade, yet somehow came out of it with even more mystique. She became a symbol of defiant womanhood in an age that punished queens for blinking too loud. By the time Henry died, Eleanor had outlasted him, outmaneuvered him, and outmythologized him. The result? Henry became the brooding king with a lion for a wife, a ruler whose greatness seemed to exist only because it had to contend with Eleanor. And now, fast forward 3 centuries. Enter Catherine de' Medici. Italian by birth, French by marriage, Catherine married Henry II of France, a man more devoted to his mistress than to court strategy. But when Henry died in a jousting accident, Catherine emerged from the shadows like smoke from a censer. She ruled France in all but name, through her sons Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. Her political toolkit, alliances, religious tightropes, and an unshakable reputation for poison. Whether or not she actually employed toxic substances is still up for debate, but in the public imagination, Catherine became the architect of intrigue, the Black Widow of the Valois court. Where Eleanor inspired admiration and war ballads, Catherine inspired fear and conspiracy theories. In Protestant circles, she became the scapegoat for everything. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, court murders, you name it. She wasn't just a queen dowager, she was a Machiavellian archetype. Yet both women, Eleanor and Catherine, share a curious legacy. They're remembered more vividly than their husbands, more narratively rich, more emotionally charged. Eleanor turned Henry II into a tragic patriarch. Catherine turned Henry II of France into a romantic footnote. The king, who died before the real drama began, and both women, in their own time, were hated for it. Powerful queens have always made people nervous. A woman with influence must either be sainted or smeared, and these two were smeared thoroughly. Eleanor as a traitor mother, Catherine as a devil queen. Yet, somehow, the reputation stuck. Not just to them, but to the men they married. And in both cases, the husband's legend, their story, is now inextricable from the queen's shadow. But speaking of shadows, some queens never even got to meet the women who shaped their fates. They fought across letters, across claims, across thrones, and in one legendary case, they never met at all. 2 queens, 2 claims, and a death warrant written without ever sharing a room. 42. The queens who shared a throne but never met. In the drama of the 16th century, no rivalry was more baroque, more psychologically rich, or more fatefully entangled than that of Mary, Queen of Scots, and her cousin Elizabeth I. Both were queens. Both were granddaughters of Henry VII. Mary through his daughter Margaret Tudor, and Elizabeth through his son Henry VIII. Both had strong claims to the English throne, and yet these 2 women, whose lives circled each other like wary hawks, never met in person. Never once. Not even as children. Not as rivals. Not as queen and prisoner. Instead, they corresponded. Through letters, envoys, spies, and occasionally through veiled insults wrapped in diplomatic pleasantries. Their relationship existed entirely in the realm of projection. 2 women imagining each other as enemy, cousin, mirror. Mary's early life played out like a romance novel. Crowned Queen of Scots as an infant, she was raised in the glittering courts of France, married a prince, and returned to Scotland as a Catholic queen in a newly Protestant land. Her rule quickly devolved into scandal, murder, and betrayal. Her second husband was murdered under suspicious circumstances. Her third, the probable culprit, became her consort. By 1567, Mary was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. She fled south, into the arms of her cousin Elizabeth, hoping for sanctuary. What she received was house arrest, 18 years of it. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was playing a different game. The Virgin Queen, the reluctant ruler, the Protestant anchor in a storm of Catholic plots. Mary's presence in England was a threat, a rallying point for enemies who saw Elizabeth as illegitimate and Mary as the rightful queen. And yet, Elizabeth hesitated. For nearly 2 decades, she kept Mary under guard but alive. Not out of mercy, but out of calculation. Killing a fellow queen was not just morally fraught, it was politically dangerous. It set a precedent. It crossed a line. But the line was crossed anyway. In 1586, after years of tension, Elizabeth's spies uncovered the Babington Plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. Whether Mary was directly involved or merely adjacent remains debated, but the evidence was enough. Elizabeth signed the warrant, and then, allegedly, tried to revoke it. But it was too late. In February 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. Her cousin never came to see her, never said goodbye, never explained. And in death, Mary's legend bloomed. To Catholics, she was a martyr. To Protestants, a danger neutralized. To poets and painters, a tragic beauty felled by politics. And to her son, James VI, the one who inherited both crowns, she became an image to manage, revise, and distance from. 2 queens, 1 throne, no meeting, no reconciliation, just letters, legends, and the quiet, uneasy space where 2 lives touched but never overlapped. And that, silence, the space where power and fear refused to meet, left a kind of historical echo, one that would repeat again, because in Scotland kings didn't always die on battlefields. Sometimes they died in strange, hidden places, where walls whispered and floors concealed more than stone. 43. 2 Scottish kings, killed in bizarrely. Private ways, Scotland has never shied away from violent exits when it comes to kings. But sometimes the exits aren't noble or even dramatic. Sometimes they're just weird, undignified, suspiciously quiet, less like battlefield deaths and more like something out of a noir thriller. Poorly lit, muddy, and almost too convenient. Take, for instance, James III of Scotland. Not to be confused with James VI, later James I of England. This James ruled during the early 15th century, and his death reads like something out of a grim political fable. In 1437, James was staying at the Blackfriars Monastery in Perth, an otherwise serene location, until it became a trap. A group of conspirators, nobles with grievances and a long memory, had planned to assassinate the king. But the details get odd. The culprits had inside help from the king's own chamberlain. They managed to sneak into the monastery with relative ease. And when the guards couldn't be found, it turned out they'd mysteriously gone elsewhere. James realized the danger far too late and tried to flee through the building, only to find that the usual exit routes had been deliberately sealed off. Desperate, he removed floorboards in one of the lavatory passages and climbed down into what was essentially a medieval sewer channel, a stone-lined culvert beneath the monastery floor. Yes, Scotland's monarch, descendant of saints and warriors, was hiding in the plumbing. The assassins found him anyway. The official version is that he was stabbed multiple times in that filthy, narrow space, betrayed by people within his own circle. The king, who had once boasted of a well-organized reign, ended his life crouched under floorboards, trying to outrun a conspiracy that had been fermenting behind his back for years. And then there's James III, another Scottish monarch whose death was murky, unresolved, and, like James I, unsettlingly quiet. James III wasn't popular. He had a knack for alienating the nobility, favoring low-born advisors and avoiding open conflict. In 1488, his teenage son, the future James IV, was placed at the head of a rebel faction. A civil war, cloaked in filial concern, broke out. The 2 sides met at the Battle of Sauchiburn, and that's where the story gets slippery. Officially, James III died during the retreat, possibly in flight from the battlefield. But how exactly he died is contested. Some say he was murdered by a soldier posing as a priest. Others say he was found alive, then killed later in cold blood. Some reports claim he bled out alone. There are even tales that the body was discovered in a ditch, far from the heat of the battle. No glorious death in defense of the realm. No rousing final speech. Just an isolated, almost forgettable exit for a sitting king. What links these 2 royal deaths is not just their Scottishness or their eeriness, but how intensely personal they were. Not grand acts of war, not martyrs on the scaffold, but monarchs removed almost surgically in spaces where no one was meant to see, where the line between public power and private vulnerability collapsed entirely, and their fates echo beyond their reigns. Because when kings die like that, shrouded in silence, twisted into rumor, it becomes harder to tell myth from reality, harder to say who struck the blow, or why. And in that void, the legends flourish. Speaking of legends, there's one royal name that history seems to hate over and over. Not for what they did, but just for who they were named after. 3 names, 3 stories, and one weird pattern that might just make you rethink the whole idea of dynastic branding. 44. The unluckiest royal name in England. Some kings die in battle, others in bed. Some go out in a blaze of political martyrdom. And then there are the ones who just seem doomed from birth. Not because of their policies or their personalities, but because of their names. In England, some names carry baggage. Heavy, ill-fated, crown-splintering baggage. Let's begin with the name John. There's only ever been one King John in English history, and frankly, that was enough. John, the youngest son of Henry II, came to the throne in 1199 after the death of his popular brother, Richard the Lionheart. John's reign was a cascade of disasters, lost wars, collapsed alliances, baronial revolts, and eventually a forced signature on the Magna Carta, which may sound noble now, but at the time was basically a list of baronial demands scribbled in the king's blood. He died unloved, in poor health, and likely while fleeing yet another civil crisis. His name was never used again by an English king. Not once. No King John II. It became, unofficially, a kind of dynastic jinx. Then there's Richard, the name that once conjured images of crusading glory, thanks to Richard Thirst, quickly curdled into royal catastrophe. Richard II, the sensitive, artistic, and deeply unpopular monarch, was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke. He died in captivity, possibly murdered, possibly starved. Either way, unceremonious. Richard III tried to rehabilitate the name, and arguably ruled with greater competence than he's often credited for, but he also seized the crown under dubious circumstances and became the main suspect in the disappearance of the princes in the Tower. He died at Bosworth Field, the last English king to fall in battle, and was buried without honors, rediscovered centuries later under a Leicester car park. 2 Richards, 2 unhappy endings. The name, once kingly, became cursed. And then, of course, there's Harold. Harold II Godwinson, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England, reigned for less than a year. He fought off a Viking invasion in the north, rushed south to defend his throne, and was killed at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Famously, perhaps apocryphally, by an arrow to the eye. After his death, the Norman conquest reshaped England permanently. No king ever took the name Harold again. The name was retired by conquest. Now, compare that to Henry. 8 English kings bore the name. Some were disastrous, yes. Henry VI spent much of his reign in mental instability and lost the 100 Years' War. But others, like Henry II and Henry VII, helped consolidate power. Even Henry VIII, for all his personal failings and 6 matrimony chaos, redefined monarchy itself. The name, despite the drama, persisted. So what gives? Why did some names become unusable, while others endured? Part of it's about optics. Monarchs don't just inherit crowns, they inherit narratives. Calling yourself John II or Richard IV means inviting direct comparison to men who lost kingdoms, who were hated, betrayed, or buried in disgrace. No king wants that kind of PR. Royal naming isn't just tradition, it's strategy, it's mythology management, a subtle, deeply superstitious refusal to tempt fate with the wrong syllables. And in England, certain names just come with more ghosts than crowns. 45. 2 Margarets, who tried to rule through their sons. In the vast family tree of English royalty, a surprising number of women named Margaret show up right at the moments when everything is falling apart. And 2 in particular, one a queen consort, the other a kingmaker matriarch, attempted the same bold strategy in different centuries, ruling through their sons. One tried to keep her dynasty alive, the other tried to create one from scratch. Neither sat on a throne themselves, but both tried to put a crown on a boy's head and keep it there by sheer willpower alone. Let's start with Margaret of Anjou, the 15th century queen consort of Henry VI, and one of the driving forces behind the Wars of the Roses. Her husband was not what you'd call forceful. Henry VI was deeply religious, politically indecisive, and periodically incapacitated. In his absence, both physical and mental, Margaret took over, not just as queen, but as strategist, leader, and field commander. She made enemies quickly. But she was also the only reason the Lancastrian cause stayed alive, as long as it did. Her son, Edward of Westminster, became her great hope, the future of the dynasty, the living justification for every battle she fought. The Lancastrian resistance wasn't just about restoring Henry to the throne. It became a mission to secure the crown for Edward. Margaret raised him with war in his blood and vengeance in his education. By the time Edward was a teenager, he was reportedly eager, perhaps too eager, to see enemies fall. But in 1471, everything collapsed. The Lancastrian army was defeated at the Battle of Tewkesbury, and Edward, just 17, was killed in the aftermath. Margaret was captured, imprisoned, and eventually ransomed back to France, defeated, disgraced, and, most importantly, childless. Her attempt to rule through her son ended in blood and silence. Now shift to the next century and meet Margaret Beaufort. This Margaret didn't start as a queen. She was a wealthy noblewoman from a powerful family, married off as a teenager and widowed early. Her son, Henry Tudor, was born during a civil war and raised mostly in exile. He had a weak claim to the throne, descended through a line the crown had declared illegitimate, and no army to speak of. But Margaret believed. She schemed, networked, and played the long game. By 1485, she had arranged a coalition strong enough to put her son on the throne. Henry landed in Wales, marched into England, and defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. He became Henry VII, first monarch of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret, who had never worn a crown herself, now walked the court in rich robes and was titled My Lady the King's Mother. The contrast between the two Margarets is haunting. One went all in during a civil war, only to see her son fall before he could truly rule. The other waited, plotted, and triumphed, installing her line on the throne for over a century. One gambled everything on a lost cause. The other rewrote the game. But both were women navigating a system built to exclude them, using motherhood as both shield and sword. They couldn't rule directly, so they ruled by proxy. In their hands, maternity became monarchy, and the results still echo in the royal bloodlines. And as history loves to remind us, sometimes it isn't just the people who matter, it's the titles. Because coming up next is a story of two men with the same name and same title, both tangled in the same throne-grabbing schemes, both ending up in the same place, the execution block, 46. Same script, different. Earl of Warwick. If you ever find yourself with a royal grudge and the title Earl of Warwick, may I kindly suggest you stay away from succession disputes, because history, cruel, ironic history, has a funny way of treating two very different men with the same title exactly the same. Meet the first one, Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, better known to history as the Kingmaker. Neville was one of the most powerful noblemen in 15th century England, rich, ambitious, and cunning enough to think he could make and unmake monarchs like rearranging chess pieces. He helped Edward IV seize the throne from the Lancastrians. Then, when Edward started making his own decisions, including marrying someone Warwick didn't approve of, he turned around and helped restore Henry VI. Yes, the same Henry VI who could barely string together a political sentence without collapsing into religious despair. Warwick's whiplash-inducing allegiances earned him a reputation, not as a loyal subject, but as a king in everything but name. In a land drowning in political chaos, Neville believed the real power was behind the throne, not on it. He was wrong. At the Battle of Barnet in 1471, his army was defeated, and Warwick was killed in the fight. The Kingmaker died trying to shuffle the deck one last time. Now, fast forward 20 years to another Earl of Warwick, Edward Plantagenet, son of George, Duke of Clarence. He was a Yorkist prince, technically next in line to the throne under Richard III. But after Richard's death and Henry VII's rise, young Edward became a threat by birth alone. Henry VII, always the cautious monarch, imprisoned Edward in the Tower of London from a young age. He lived most of his life in confinement, not for what he did, but for who he might one day become. Then came Perkin Warbeck, a pretender claiming to be one of the lost princes in the Tower. Warbeck's rebellion failed, but somehow Edward of Warwick was implicated in the plot. In 1499, at the age of 24, he was executed, still technically the Earl of Warwick, still without a real chance to rule. 2 earls, 2 executions, 2 lives entangled in royal drama, one as a puppet master, the other as a potential puppet. Neither lived to see their plans, or others' plans for them, succeed. The same title, the same fate. Because in royal history, some roles are more cursed than crowned. And in the next act, we meet 2 men named Robert, who soared too close to the sun, charming, adored, and then obliterated. 47. 2 royal favorites called Robert, who flew too high. In court, as in mythology, flying too close to the sun never ends well. And if your name happened to be Robert, the odds were even worse, at least in the English and early British royal courts. 2 such Roberts, separated by a few decades and a change of dynasty, found themselves launched from obscurity into the glittering orbit of monarchs. They rose quickly, spectacularly, and then they fell, hard. First, there was Robert Devereux, the 2nd Earl of Essex, a dashing, temperamental aristocrat who became Queen Elizabeth I's favorite in the final years of her reign. Charismatic and just young enough to be forgiven his blunders, until he wasn't. Devereux came into Elizabeth's court already carrying the prestige of his stepfather, Robert Dudley, the Queen's earlier favorite. But young Robert was no quiet courtier. He was brash, vain, and addicted to warfare as performance. Elizabeth indulged him, gave him command, sent him to Ireland to put down rebellion. And it was there that things unraveled. Devereux made peace with the rebels, without royal permission. Then, in an act of arrogance or desperation, or both, he abandoned his post and burst into the Queen's bedchamber unannounced, a scandal even in Elizabeth's relatively theatrical court. The trust evaporated. His enemies closed in. Eventually, he attempted a failed coup against the Queen's advisors and was arrested for treason. In 1601, Robert Devereux was executed. The Queen reportedly signed the death warrant with great reluctance, and never quite recovered emotionally. His fall was a public rupture, a cautionary tale about favoritism gone too far. Now, jump ahead to the reign of James I, Elizabeth's Scottish successor. He had his own Robert, Robert Carr, a handsome, clever young man who caught the king's eye after falling off a horse during a joust. Yes, that's how it started. James was instantly taken with him, raised him to the peerage, and eventually made him Earl of Somerset. Like Devereux, Carr was showered with titles and influence, though unlike Elizabeth, James was less reserved about the personal nature of the relationship. But Carr's downfall came via marriage, specifically his scandalous union with Frances Howard, a noblewoman who had her first marriage annulled in humiliating fashion to be with him. When a political enemy, Sir Thomas Overbury, objected to the match, he ended up dead, poisoned. The fallout was national tabloid material. Though Carr's direct guilt was questionable, the scandal splashed across both him and Frances. He lost his position, was imprisoned, and though eventually pardoned, never regained favor. Both Roberts began as bright stars. Both were consumed by the dangerous intimacy of power. One tried to stage a rebellion. The other got pulled into a murder mystery. Different monarchs, different motives. Same trajectory, and perhaps it's no surprise. Perhaps it's no Royal courts have always been unstable ecosystems, high on rewards, brutal with punishment. Favorites live by attention and die by it. And for the Stuart dynasty, this cycle of crisis and downfall wasn't limited to individuals. Entire months, it seemed, were cursed, especially one in particular, cold, solemn, and stained with consequence. January 48. The Stuart kings and their January disasters. In the royal calendar of the Stuart dynasty, January reads less like a month and more like a warning label. Something about the way that winter light hits the stones of Whitehall must have triggered fate, because for 3 generations of Stuart monarchs, January wasn't just cold, it was lethal. The most infamous case, of course, is Charles I. On January 30th, 1649, he was executed outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, having lost a civil war to his own people. The execution was a seismic moment in British history, the first and only time an English king was formally tried and publicly killed for treason against the country he ruled. And the setting couldn't have been more poetic, in the darkest way. Directly above the execution platform, inside the banqueting house, was a ceiling painted by Peter Paul Rubens, glorifying Charles's father, James I, as a God-anointed monarch ascending into heaven. The Stuart vision of divine right, literally overhead, as Charles's head came off below. But the doom didn't stop there. Decades later, Charles's son, Charles II, inherited the throne after the monarchy was restored in 1660. And although he died peacefully in 1685, the trauma of his father's execution never left the national psyche. Every year on January 30th, sermons were held to commemorate Charles I's martyrdom. For a time, it was a solemn national day, part grief, part warning, part political theater. And it wasn't just Charles Ferdinand II. The entire Glorious Revolution, which saw Charles II's brother, James II, deposed, was set into motion just weeks after one of the coldest winters on record. By January 1689, James was exiled, replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary II and her Dutch husband William of Orange. But perhaps the oddest twist came earlier, with the Gunpowder Plot. While the plan to blow up Parliament was meant for November 5th, it was in January 1606 that the trials and executions of Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators were carried out. And those January hangings and quarterings, however sanitized the version is now, became part of the Stuart regime's founding myth. The king had survived. The traitors had not. January, then, became not just a backdrop, but a symbol of danger, reckoning, sacrifice. It was a month when revolts reached verdicts, when monarchs fell, when the temperature dropped and royal blood spilled figuratively and literally. And amid all that winter drama, one queen would eventually bring the kingdom together, even as fate ensured that the moment she did, she'd leave it barren. A queen surrounded by ghosts, union, and 17 tragic losses. 49. The battle that hand-delivered the Union Jack. There are political unions forged by vision, and then there are the ones forged by disaster. The creation of Great Britain in 1707, the formal union of England and Scotland, was long in the making, but only sealed when there were no other options left. The dynasty was out of heirs, the realm was out of patience, and the continent was teetering toward chaos. Enter Queen Anne. Her reign, while often remembered for teacups, wigs, and soft-spoken portraits, was one of the most turbulent in the background. She came to the throne in 1702, following the death of William III, and she was, crucially, the last monarch of the House of Stuart. But what drove the final unification of England and Scotland wasn't just diplomacy, it was desperation. Anne had suffered at least 17 pregnancies, but not one of her children survived to adulthood. The crown teetered on the brink of a succession vacuum. The English Parliament, desperate to avoid a Catholic Stuart return, think exiled James II and his descendants, passed the Act of Settlement in 1701, naming the German House of Hanover as the next Protestant heirs. Scotland, however, hadn't agreed to this. Tensions rose. And the fear was real. If the two nations split on succession, war could return. So the solution? A political marriage, the Act of Union in 1707. The new kingdom was called Great Britain, and it came with a new flag, the Union Jack, which blended the crosses of St. George and St. Andrew. Symbolically neat, practically messy, but crucially, it avoided civil war, just barely. So the modern UK, its identity, its symbols, even its monarchy, owes much to Anne's body, or more precisely, what didn't come from it. Her failure to produce a surviving heir forced Parliament to legislate a whole new future. She was the queen who bore the Union but left no one behind to inherit it. And so, with the ink still drying on the most important constitutional act in centuries, Britain looked to a new dynasty, German, Protestant, and entirely foreign. The Hanoverians would take over next, but only because fate, biology, and 17 heartbreaks made every other option impossible. And what followed next? Well, if you squint at the family trees hard enough, you'll find a Tudor daughter quietly shaping that future, a royal wildcard who, through a twist of marriage and survival, linked two crowns that were never supposed to meet. 50. Richard III's body and the car park lines. For over 5 centuries, the body of Richard III, England's last Plantagenet king, was considered lost. Not lost in the romantic sense, not hidden in a mountain cavern or preserved in a hidden tomb with angels standing guard. Just missing, misfiled by history. A human footnote disappeared somewhere beneath the tarmac of modern indifference. And then in 2012, a group of historians, archaeologists, and just enough amateur obsession decided to look under a Leicester City car park. That's not where you expect to find a king. And yet, there he was. They had maps. Old ones. Faded, imprecise, medieval plans showing the location of Greyfriars Church, where Richard was allegedly buried in 1485 after his death at the Battle of Bosworth Field. It was a hasty, humble burial for a man who died fighting for a crown he had seized and was never forgiven for. Later centuries demolished the church, paved the land, built structures, and eventually turned the whole site into a council car park with clearly painted bays. One of those bays, letter J, sat exactly above what used to be the choir of the church. That's where they found him. The skeleton was unmistakable. Scoliosis, curved spine, evidence of multiple battle wounds, male, early 30s, matching Richard's profile. DNA testing confirmed it, using living descendants. Against all odds, the remains of a famously lost king had been perfectly aligned with an ancient map and a modern parking space. It was almost too precise. A former king, denounced by Shakespeare, vilified for the presumed murder of his nephews, and buried in a forgotten grave, turns up exactly where medieval chroniclers said he would be, 500 years later, wedged between yellow lines and shopping trolleys. Some called it divine irony. Others just called it England. The parking lot became a shrine. The bones were reburied with honor in Leicester Cathedral, but the ghost of the car park still lingers over his legacy. Richard had died at the end of one royal era, the last king to die in battle on English soil, and his reappearance in the most mundane of places felt like history reminding us of its own punchlines. And while Richard's remains were rediscovered with forensic exactness, the monarch who followed him, Henry VII, built his reign on something much harder to trace: coincidence, absence, and just enough mystery to make a claim seem legitimate. Which brings us to the strange case of royal celebrations, and how the monarchy has a curious habit of toasting its own endurance just as it's about to hit a crisis point. 51. The two queens who celebrated the wrong anniversary. There's something unnerving about a royal celebration that arrives just before disaster. It's as if the bunting is whispering, "Enjoy this while it lasts." Let's begin in the year 1810. George III and Queen Charlotte were marking their golden wedding anniversary, 50 years of marriage, which for royals and commoners alike was no small feat. The celebrations were restrained but respectful. A king and queen who had weathered wars, uprisings, and the birth of the modern British Empire were now the image of stable, long-reigning monarchy. Except they weren't. Because just as the public was clinking glasses and toasting the royal couple, George III's mental health took a catastrophic turn. Within months of the anniversary, he had retreated entirely from public life, unfit to reign, living in shadowed seclusion at Windsor Castle, while his son ruled as Prince Regent. It was as if the Golden Jubilee had cursed him. Now jump forward exactly 202 years, to 2012, when Queen Elizabeth II celebrated her Diamond Jubilee, 60 years on the throne. The event was massive, a national holiday, river pageants, fireworks, pop concerts, tea towels. Britain congratulated itself on having weathered modernity with its monarch intact. But offstage, another storm was gathering. The Jubilee was quickly followed by a dramatic acceleration in debates over the monarchy's future, particularly in Scotland, where momentum for independence was surging. Within 2 years, the 2014 independence referendum would bring the United Kingdom to the edge of constitutional redefinition. And while the Union survived that vote, the cracks were now permanent. 2 major royal anniversaries, 2 monarchs, 2 crises that appeared almost poetically in the celebratory afterglow. It's almost as if the monarchy has an inbuilt warning system. When the pageantry gets too bright, the shadows aren't far behind, and if those patterns feel a little too perfect, it's worth considering that sometimes numbers themselves begin to play tricks, clustering in ways that seem, if not mystical, at least suspiciously elegant. Especially around one man who lived to 99 on the 99th day of the year after 73 years of marriage. Do the math. 52. The number 9. Around Prince Philip. When Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, died on April 9, 2021, it didn't take long for people to start counting. He was 99 years old. He died on the 9th of April, which was also the 99th day of the year, in non-leap years. He had been married to Queen Elizabeth II for 73 years. 7 plus 3, as many numerologists eagerly pointed out, equals 10, just one shy of that perfect round 100. And, as if the arithmetic weren't odd enough, he had married Elizabeth 9 years after she was born. All these 9s, all this symmetry. To rationalists, it's just coincidence. The statistical equivalent of flipping a coin 100 times and getting a few weird streaks. But the British royal family has always lived in the strange intersection between history and mythology, where dates matter, names recur, and numbers start to feel symbolic whether you want them to or not. The press, for its part, leaned in. Headlines remarked on the eerie numerology. Social media spun it into memes and tribute posts. And somewhere in the middle of all that, it became clear. Even in death, Prince Philip was part of a pattern. Not just a pattern of numbers, but of how the monarchy is mourned and mythologized. He had been, for most of his life, the ever-present consort, sharp-tongued, reserved, the royal who stood a step behind. And yet his departure, with its tidy 9s and final symmetry, reminded the public just how long he had anchored the institution. He was there for the moon landing, the Cold War, the Beatles, Brexit, pandemic lockdowns. Through it all, there he stood, the fixed point behind the crown. And then, just like that, gone. At 99, on the 99th day, with numbers that lined up too neatly to ignore. If you were looking for signs, this was a jackpot. But the truth is, the royal family has always known how to exit stage left before things get too messy. Even abdications, those most scandalous of exits, have a curious way of happening just in time, just before something worse might have followed. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or maybe abdication is the monarchy's get-out-of-trouble-free card, played only when the storm is already brewing. 53. The monarchy's favorite escape clause, abdications by coincidence. When Edward VIII abdicated in 1936, it was, officially, for love. His desire to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American, was framed as a personal choice that conflicted with his role as head of the Church of England. The state gave him a choice, crown or bride. He chose the latter, stepped down, and let his shy younger brother become George VI. But what if there was more to it? What if the abdication was a blessing in disguise, not just for the monarchy, but for history itself? Because Edward VIII wasn't just in love with Wallis. He was also notoriously sympathetic to Nazi Germany, to the point where his post-abdication travels raised diplomatic alarms. He met Hitler. He expressed views that, even in the 1930s, were dangerously naive at best. Had he remained king into the Second World War, it's hard to imagine Britain's leadership, or its moral compass, surviving intact. In short, his departure spared the monarchy from its darkest timeline. And then, decades later, other monarchies started doing something eerily similar. In the Netherlands, Queen Beatrix abdicated in 2013, right before Republican movements reached fever pitch. In Spain, King Juan Carlos III stepped down in 2014 amid corruption scandals and anti-monarchy protests. In both cases, the timing was curious. Public opinion had soured, the optics were bad, and suddenly the monarchs voluntarily made way for younger heirs. These weren't abdications of failure, they were strategic vanishings. Step aside just before the crisis hits, let a fresh face take the heat, reset the public narrative. In that light, abdication isn't a collapse. It's a self-preservation mechanism, a royal ejector seat. When used correctly, it keeps the institution intact by sacrificing the individual, which, if you think about it, is very on-brand for monarchy. So maybe Edward VIII didn't fall. Maybe he was pushed by fate before he could pull the whole edifice down with him. And maybe, just maybe, the most enduring trick the monarchy ever learned was knowing when to disappear, before history finishes the sentence for you.